Tonight, before we journey into the Buddha's wisdom, we first create a sanctuary of stillness. This moment right here is your transition from the doing of the day into the being of the night. Let everything that came before fall away. Let everything that might come tomorrow wait outside this space. Welcome to Buddha Bedtime Stories. This is where you come not to learn or accomplish, but simply to rest in the presence of ancient wisdom. I'd love to know, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you settling in to listen tonight? Please share in the comments below. Feel yourself arriving here fully. Notice how your body has been carrying you all day, holding tension you didn't even know was there. This is your invitation to finally completely let go. The Buddha's teachings we'll explore tonight begin not with effort, but with this very releasing, this softening into what is. Before any words, before any stories, there is just this. Your breath, your body, this present moment. Rest here first. Let the stillness find you. There's no rush. The teachings will wait while you settle into the peace that's already here, beneath everything. Now, give yourself permission to get truly, deeply comfortable. Adjust your position until your body whispers, "Yes, this is right." Feel the weight of your head on the pillow, the way the bed or chair holds you completely. You are supported. You can let go. Take a long, slow breath in, feeling your entire body expand with the inhale. Hold it gently at the top, then release it all, feeling yourself sink deeper into rest with the exhale. Again, breathing in peace, breathing out the last remnants of the day. And once more, this time letting the exhale carry you even deeper into stillness. Feel that? That quiet that's settling over you? Rest here for just a moment longer. This calm is your foundation. From this place of rest, we'll now receive the Buddha's teachings. Let us begin with our first story. There was a monk named Ryusei who lived simply in a small temple at the edge of a town. He owned very little, just what was necessary for his practice and daily life. Among his few possessions was a pair of sturdy sandals he had received as a gift from his teacher when he first became a monk. They were well made, comfortable, and had served him faithfully for 7 years. One morning, Ryusei woke to discover his sandals were gone. Someone had stolen them during the night. He stood at the temple entrance, looking at the empty space where his shoes had been, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Anger at the theft, worry about how he would afford new sandals on no income, sadness at losing a gift from his beloved teacher, attachment to these particular shoes that had carried him so many miles. As he stood there, a neighbor passed by and noticed his bare feet. "Ryusei-san, where are your shoes?" "Someone took them during the night," Ryusei replied. "What? That's terrible. You should report it to the magistrate. We can't have thieves in this neighborhood." But Ryusei shook his head slowly. No need to involve the magistrate. "But you need shoes, and the thief needs to be punished." Ryusei was quiet for a moment, watching the morning light spread across the ground. Then he said something that puzzled the neighbor. "I hope they fit him well." The night was cold. Perhaps his need for shoes was greater than mine. The neighbor went away confused, but Ryusei meant what he said. As he sat with his initial reactions of anger and loss, he began to examine them more carefully. Why was he so upset? because someone had taken something that belonged to him. But had it really belonged to him? He hadn't made the sandals himself. They had been given to him by his teacher, who had received them from someone else, who had purchased them from a craftsman who made them from materials that came from plants and animals, which came from the earth. At what point in this chain had the sandals become his? He had been using them, yes, they had been in his possession. But possession is temporary, always. Whether stolen, worn out, or outlived by his own death, those sandals were never going to be his permanently. They were just passing through his life for a time, and now they had passed on to someone else. This understanding brought a strange peace. Instead of focusing on what he had lost, Ryusei found himself thinking about the person who had taken the shoes. What desperation drives someone to steal shoes from a poor monk? What circumstances had brought them to this temple in the middle of the night, in need of footwear? Ryusei spent the day walking barefoot, which he hadn't done since childhood. He noticed things he never noticed while wearing shoes. The texture of different surfaces beneath his feet. The temperature of stones that had been in sun versus shade. The careful attention required to avoid sharp objects. The humility of going barefoot while others wore shoes. That evening, another monk from a neighboring temple visited. Hearing about the stolen sandals, he immediately offered Ryusei a spare pair he had. Ryusei accepted gratefully, but he noticed something. If he had spent the whole day angry about the theft, bitter about his loss, he would have missed the insights that came from walking barefoot. He would have missed the kindness of this monk's offering. He would have poisoned his whole day with resentment over something that was already gone and couldn't be changed. Instead, by letting go of attachment to the stolen shoes, by wishing well for the thief, by being present to what actually was rather than resenting what was no longer, he had passed the day in relative peace. A student who heard this story asked Ryusei, "But Master, didn't you feel angry? Isn't anger at injustice natural?" "Of course I felt angry," Ryusei replied. For about 10 minutes, anger arose, just as it arises for anyone when something is taken from them. But then I had a choice. I could feed that anger, nurture it, build stories around it, carry it with me all day, letting it poison my mind and disturb my peace. Or I could acknowledge it, let it pass, and choose a different relationship with what had happened. "But the thief should be punished," the student insisted. "What he did was wrong. Perhaps he will be punished by his own conscience," Ryusei said. "Perhaps he is punished already by whatever circumstances drove him to steal from a poor monk. But whether he is punished or not is not my concern. My concern is whether I will punish myself by holding resentment or free myself by letting go." He looked at his new sandals, the gift from his fellow monk. "These shoes came to me because those shoes left me. If I had been so attached to the old shoes that I refused to accept new ones, I would still be barefoot." Life is constantly taking things from us and giving things to us. We suffer when we cling too tightly to what's being taken, and when we refuse to receive what's being offered. The student was quiet, thinking about this teaching. Finally, he asked, "So you're saying we shouldn't care about our possessions? We should just let people take whatever they want?" "I'm saying we should hold our possessions lightly," Ryusei replied. "Use them while we have them, Appreciate them, but know that we never truly own anything. Everything we think we possess is just temporarily in our care. When it leaves us, whether through loss or theft or natural decay, we can let it go without adding the suffering of clinging to the simple fact of its absence. He smiled, remembering the cold night when his shoes were taken. That thief taught me something valuable. He showed me how attached I was to those sandals, how much of my sense of security was tied to possessions. He gave me an opportunity to practice letting go. In a way, though it wasn't his intention, he gave me a gift even as he took something from me. Years later, Rousseau would tell people, "The shoes I lost mattered less than what I learned by losing them." The thief took my sandals, but gave me a teaching about non-attachment. Most of what we think we own, we don't. Most of what we think we need, we don't. And most of what we think would destroy us to lose, we can actually live without quite peacefully. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what you're holding too tightly. What possessions, what relationships, what ideas, what version of yourself are you clinging to, fearing their loss? What if you held these things the way Ryusei learned to hold his sandals? With appreciation while they're present, with acceptance when they leave. Nothing you possess is truly yours to keep. Everything is temporary, passing through your life for a time. This doesn't mean you can't enjoy these things or care for them. It means you don't have to suffer when they inevitably pass on. Rest now in empty hands, knowing that holding loosely allows life to flow through your grasp. What needs to stay will stay. What needs to go will go. And you can be at peace either way, not because you don't care, but because you understand that ownership was always an illusion and loss was always inevitable. Let go tonight of everything you've been trying so hard to hold onto, and notice how light your hands feel when they're finally open. There was a poet named Ren who had written beautiful poems for many years. His words flowed easily, and people treasured his work. But one season, the words stopped coming. Ren would sit before blank paper, brush ready, ink prepared, and nothing would emerge. Day after day, week after week, the page remained empty. He tried everything. He read other poets' work, hoping for inspiration. He visited beautiful places, seeking images to capture. He forced himself to write, producing words that felt dead and hollow. Nothing worked. The emptiness persisted. Ren fell into despair. He believed he had lost his gift, that whatever spring of poetry had lived within him had dried up. He was no longer a poet, just someone sitting before blank pages, producing nothing. A Zen monk named Sengai heard of Ren's struggle and came to visit. He found the poet sitting in his study, surrounded by blank papers, looking defeated. "I can't write," Ren said. "The words are gone. I'm empty." Sengai picked up one of the blank pages, examining it carefully. "This paper looks full to me." Ren frowned. "It's completely blank. It's empty. That's the problem." "Is it?" Sengai held the page up to the light. "I see infinite possibilities on this page. I see every poem ever written and every poem yet to be written. I see your past work and your future work. This blank page contains everything. How can you call it empty?" "Those are just potential poems," Ren protested. "Not actual poems. Potential is nothing. I need actual words. Sengai set down the paper gently. Tell me, before you write a poem, where does it exist? In my mind, I suppose. Or in my imagination. And is that nothing? Is a poem that exists in imagination less real than a poem on paper? Or is it just a different form of the same thing? Ren started to answer, then stopped. He wasn't sure. The blank page is not the absence of poetry, Sengai continued. It's poetry in its unmanifested form, the silence before the song, the stillness before the dance. You're calling it empty because you can't see it yet. But perhaps it's more full than any written page, because it contains all possibilities rather than one actuality. He moved to the window, looking out at Ren's garden. In winter, your garden looks dead. Empty. But is it? Or is spring simply waiting, gathering itself, preparing? You wouldn't curse the winter garden for not being summer. You trust that the emptiness is part of the cycle. Why can't you trust that your blank pages are also part of the cycle? Over the following days, Ren sat with this teaching. Instead of fighting the blankness, trying to force it to become fullness, he simply sat with it. He looked at blank pages not as failures, but as potential. He experienced his internal emptiness not as loss, but as space. And slowly, something shifted. The emptiness began to feel different. Not empty, but full of possibility. Not lacking, but pregnant with what might emerge. He stopped trying to write and simply sat with a blank page, befriending it, accepting it. One morning, without force or effort, words came. Not many, just a few lines, but they felt true in a way his forced writing hadn't. They emerged from the emptiness rather than being imposed upon it. The blank page had given birth naturally, rather than being violated by his demand. Ren's poetry changed after this period. It had more space in it, more silence between words. Critics said it had deepened, become more profound. Ren knew it was because he had learned to value emptiness as much as fullness, to see the blank page not as an enemy, but as a teacher. When young poets came to him struggling with their own blank pages, their own dry periods, Ren would tell them, "Don't curse the emptiness. Don't fight the blank page." Emptiness is not the absence of poetry. It's poetry gathering itself. It's the fullness before it manifests. Trust it. Sit with it. Let it fill you in ways that words never could. The blank page is not nothing. It's everything waiting. Tonight, let yourself be blank. Let your mind be the empty page, not filled with thoughts and plans and worries. Don't see this emptiness as a lack. See it as fullness waiting, as possibility gathering, as the silence before the song. You don't need to fill every moment with content. The empty moments are just as important, just as full in their own way. Rest in emptiness. It's not nothing. It's everything you need, waiting to emerge when the time is right. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale about recognition and the true nature of worth. This is the next story. In a mountain monastery lived an old abbess named Ren, who kept in her private chamber an unusual mirror. The mirror was ancient, its surface darkened and worn until it reflected almost nothing. Visitors who saw it would often remark on its uselessness. "Your mirror shows nothing," they would say. "Why keep it? Get a new one that actually works." But Ren treasured this mirror and looked into it every morning. "It shows me exactly what I need to see," she would reply, though she never explained what she meant. One day, A vain young woman named Ayame came to the monastery seeking spiritual guidance. She was beautiful and knew it, spending hours each day on her appearance, constantly checking her reflection in every available surface. Her identity was completely wrapped up in her looks. During her first meeting with Ren, Ayame couldn't stop glancing at the darkened mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of herself. But the mirror showed nothing, just a dark, murky surface with barely a hint of reflection. "Your mirror is broken," Ayame said with annoyance. "Don't you want to see yourself?" "I see myself perfectly well in this mirror," Ren replied. "What do you see?" "Nothing. It's too dark." "Exactly," Ren said, and smiled. Ayame didn't understand, but as the days passed and she continued her stay at the monastery, she found herself repeatedly drawn to Ren's useless mirror. She would stand before it, searching for her reflection, finding almost nothing. It was deeply unsettling. Every other mirror showed her who she was, or at least showed her what she looked like. This mirror showed nothing. After a week, Ayame mentioned her frustration to Ren. "I hate your mirror. I keep looking into it hoping to see myself, but there's nothing there." "And what does that nothing teach you?" Ren asked. "That the mirror is broken." "Or that you're looking for the wrong thing," Ren suggested. "Every mirror you've ever looked into has shown you your face, your hair, your features. You've spent years studying that reflection, knowing exactly what you look like. My mirror can't show you that, so it forces you to consider, if you can't see your face, what else might you see? If appearance isn't available, what remains?" Ayame thought about this. When she looked into normal mirrors, she saw features she judged. Eyes too small, nose too sharp, skin not smooth enough. She saw an image she tried to perfect, control, improve. The looking was never really seeing. It was evaluating, criticizing, trying to manage how others would perceive her. But in Ren's dark mirror, there was nothing to evaluate, no features to judge, no appearance to control. Just dark surface and, if she looked very carefully, the barest hint of a form. Not details, just presence. "What do you see when you look in your mirror?" Ayame asked Ren. "Nothing that can be improved or criticized," Ren replied. "Nothing that age can diminish or beauty can enhance. Just the simple fact of being here, looking. The mirror that shows everything tempts you to judge what you see. The mirror that shows nothing releases you from judgment." She came to stand beside Ayame before the dark mirror. "Look at us now, standing here together. Can you see our faces?" "Barely," Ayame admitted. "Can you tell which of us is more beautiful?" "No." "Can you see our ages, our features, the details that usually define us?" "No." "Then we stand equal before this mirror," Ren said. "Not as beautiful or plain, young or old, but simply as two beings, present in this moment. The mirror that shows nothing strips away all the superficial ways we distinguish ourselves and leaves only the essential fact: we are here." Over the following weeks, Ayame found herself looking into Ren's mirror more than any of the clear mirrors in the monastery. At first, this puzzled her. Why would she choose the mirror that showed nothing? But gradually she understood. She was tired of the constant judgment that came with seeing her reflection clearly. Tired of always evaluating, always trying to improve, always wondering if she looked acceptable. The dark mirror gave her relief from all that. It let her be present without being perceived, even by herself. It let her exist without the burden of appearance. "I think I'm beginning to understand," Ayame told Ren one morning. "The mirror that shows nothing is actually showing me something very important. That I exist independent of how I look. That there's a me underneath or beyond appearance. I've spent so many years focused on my reflection that I forgot there's someone doing the looking." Ren nodded with satisfaction. "The mirror that shows everything directs your attention outward, to surface and appearance. The mirror that shows nothing directs your attention inward, to the awareness that's looking. One mirror shows you an object to be evaluated. The other mirror reveals you as a subject who is aware." She touched the darkened surface gently. "Most people think a mirror's value is in how clearly it reflects. But sometimes a mirror's greatest value is in what it doesn't show. The absence of reflection can teach what the presence of reflection never could." Ayame stayed at the monastery for 6 months, and during that time, her relationship with mirrors changed completely. She no longer felt compelled to check her reflection constantly. When she did look in clear mirrors, she no longer saw an image to be judged, but simply a face, no more or less significant than any other face. "Your dark mirror freed me," she told Ren when she prepared to leave. "I thought I needed to see myself clearly to know who I was, but actually, seeing myself clearly kept me trapped in appearance, in judgment, in the endless work of managing how I looked. Your mirror that showed nothing helped me discover the me that exists beyond appearance." After Ayame left, other students asked Ren about the mirror's teaching. "Why not just remove all mirrors?" one asked. "If the point is to free people from attachment to appearance, why have mirrors at all?" "Because running from mirrors is still being controlled by them," Ren explained. "The person who avoids all mirrors is as attached to appearance as the person who constantly looks. They're just attached to not looking rather than to looking. The dark mirror teaches something different. It teaches how to look without judgment, how to be aware of appearance without being enslaved by it." She held up the darkened mirror for the students to see. "This mirror shows that appearance and essence are not the same. The clear mirror shows you appearance so clearly that you might mistake it for essence. This dark mirror removes appearance and asks, what remains? What are you when you can't see your face? That question leads to wisdom." A philosophical student asked, "But isn't the dark mirror just another form of illusion? It hides reality rather than revealing it." "Does it?" Ren replied. "The clear mirror shows you how light reflects off your features at this particular moment from this particular angle. Is that reality? Or is that also just one kind of information, one kind of seeing? The dark mirror shows you something the clear mirror can't. Your existence independent of your reflection. Both mirrors have their uses. The question is whether you're wise enough to learn from each what it has to teach." Years later, when Ren was dying, she gave the darkened mirror to her successor with specific instructions. "Keep this mirror, even though students will mock it, even though visitors will offer to replace it. This mirror teaches what cannot be taught in words, that sometimes absence reveals more than presence, that sometimes nothing shows more than everything, that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from what we cannot see rather than from what we can. Tonight, as you rest, you might imagine looking into a mirror that shows nothing, not because the mirror is broken, but because it's teaching you something that clear mirrors never could. Without your reflection to evaluate and judge, what remains? Without your appearance to manage and improve, who are you? The mirror that shows nothing is inviting you to meet yourself beyond surface, beyond image, beyond all the ways you've learned to see yourself through others' eyes. In the dark mirror, there's just presence, just awareness, just the simple fact of being here without needing to look any particular way. Rest now in the dark mirror's teaching. Let yourself be unseen, unreflected, undefined by appearance. Let yourself exist in the space beyond image, where judgment can't reach, where evaluation has no meaning, where you simply are without needing to be any particular way. The mirror shows nothing, and in that nothing, everything essential is revealed. Sleep in that revelation tonight. As we move deeper into the quiet teachings of Zen, we come to a story about seeing clearly and understanding true value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a village garden, there lived a harmless snake that ate insects and kept the vegetable patch healthy. The gardener, an old man named Hideaki, appreciated the snake and would nod to it when he saw it sunning itself on stones or moving slowly through the rows of vegetables. The snake was small, no thicker than Hideaki's thumb, with gentle eyes and a pattern of brown and green scales that helped it blend with the garden soil. It had lived in the garden for several years, and Hideaki had watched it grow from a tiny hatchling to its current modest size. It was a completely harmless species, one that ate only insects and small slugs, never anything larger. The snake wanted nothing to do with humans and would quickly slither away if anyone approached too closely. But Hideaki's grandson, a boy named Kyo, who was 8 years old, was terrified of the snake. He had never been bitten, never been threatened, never had any negative encounter with it at all. But he had heard stories from other children about snakes being dangerous. His friend's older brother had told elaborate tales about venomous snakes that could kill a person with one bite. Another child had described snakes as evil creatures that attacked without warning. So every time Kyo caught a glimpse of the garden snake, he would run away screaming. His heart would race. His breath would come short and fast. His whole body would flood with terror. The sight of that small, harmless creature would send him into complete panic. Hideaki tried many times to reason with his grandson. "Kyo, this snake is harmless. See how small it is. Look at its gentle movements. It eats only insects. It helps our garden by keeping pests away. It wants nothing to do with humans. It's more afraid of you than you are of it." But Kyo wouldn't listen. His fear was too great, too consuming. The rational words his grandfather spoke couldn't penetrate the wall of terror that the very idea of the snake created in his mind. Logic had no power over the fear that gripped him. "But snakes are dangerous," Kyo would insist. "Everyone knows that. They bite people. They're scary. I don't want to go in the garden anymore." Hideaki was concerned. The boy's fear was keeping him from enjoying the garden, from helping with the vegetables, from the simple pleasure of being outdoors. The fear was limiting his life in ways that had nothing to do with actual danger. One late afternoon, Kyo was alone in the garden, sent by his mother to pick some tomatoes for dinner. He was moving carefully, nervously, constantly scanning the ground for any sign of the snake. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden path. Then he saw it. Something moving on the ground ahead of him. The shape was long and sinuous, definitely a snake. And this one was enormous, far larger than the small garden snake he had seen before. It must be a different snake, a dangerous one. The creature was at least as thick as his arm, maybe 6 or 7 feet long, moving slowly across the path. Terror seized Kyo completely. His legs locked. His breath stopped. His heart hammered so hard he could hear it in his ears. He couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare at this enormous serpent that was right in his path, blocking his way back to the house. The snake moved with a sinuous, menacing motion. Its body seemed to pulse and writhe. Kyo could see every detail of its threatening form, the dark color, the massive size, the way it seemed to be looking right at him, even though he couldn't see its head clearly. He stood there frozen, convinced he was about to be attacked, about to be bitten by this monster that had invaded his grandfather's garden. Minutes passed like hours. The snake continued its slow movement across the path, and Kyo remained paralyzed, watching it, unable to run or call for help. Finally, his grandfather came out of the house, having noticed that Kyo had been gone too long for such a simple errand. He found his grandson standing rigid with fear in the middle of the garden path, staring at the ground with eyes wide and face pale. "Kyo!" "What's wrong?" Hideaki called out, hurrying toward the boy. "A giant snake!" Kyo gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Right there! Look how huge it is! Grandfather, be careful!" Hideaki looked where his grandson was pointing. He saw the small garden snake, the same one that had lived there for years, sunning itself on the path, as it often did in the late afternoon. It was no bigger than it had ever been, perhaps 8 inches long, completely harmless. And nearby, stretching across the path in the low-angled light of the setting sun, he saw the snake's shadow. The shadow was indeed enormous, at least 6 feet long and thick, cast long and dark by the horizontal rays of the sun. The shadow looked menacing, serpentine, threatening. But it was just a shadow. Hideaki understood immediately what had happened. His grandson had seen the shadow and thought it was the snake, or thought it was a different, much larger snake. The boy's fear had locked onto the shadow and convinced him that he was seeing a genuine threat. "Kyo," Hideaki said gently, "come here. Come stand next to me." But Kyo couldn't move. "I can't. The snake is in the way. It's huge, Grandfather. It's dangerous." "Trust me," Hideaki said, his voice calm and steady. "Take my hand. I promise you're safe." Slowly, with trembling steps, Kyo moved toward his grandfather, keeping his eyes on the enormous snake the entire time, certain it would strike at any moment. Hideaki took his grandson's hand and led him closer to where the small garden snake lay on the path. As they approached, something remarkable happened. The shadow shortened. The closer they got, the smaller the shadow became. By the time they stood right next to the actual snake, which quickly slithered away into the vegetables, startled by their approach, the shadow was appropriately small, no more threatening than the creature that cast it. Kyo stared at where the snake had been, then at where its shadow had stretched across the path. His breathing was still rapid, his heart still pounding, but confusion was beginning to replace terror. "The shadow," he whispered. I thought the shadow was the snake, or a different snake, a huge one." "I know," Hideaki said, kneeling down beside his grandson. "Come, let me show you something." He picked up a stick from the ground, about the same size as the garden snake. In the low afternoon sun, he held it at different angles, casting its shadow on the path. When he held it close to the ground, the shadow was small. But when he held it higher, angled toward the sun, the shadow grew enormous, stretching across the entire path. "See?" Hideaki said. "Any small thing can cast a large shadow under the right conditions. The shadow tells you nothing about the actual size or danger of the thing. It just tells you about the light and the angle and your position relative to it." Kyo watched, fascinated despite his lingering fear, as his grandfather made the stick's shadow grow and shrink, made it look threatening or harmless just by changing the angle. "The snake didn't change," Hideaki continued. "It was always small and harmless. But the shadow changed based on the light, and you saw the shadow and thought it was showing you the truth about the snake. But shadows can lie, or rather, shadows can exaggerate. They can make something small look huge, something harmless look dangerous." He set down the stick and took both of Kyo's hands. "This is what fear does, grandson. Fear is like that low sun. It casts everything in shadow, making it look bigger and more dangerous than it actually is. The snake didn't change. Your perception of it changed based on angle, light, and most importantly, based on your expectation of danger." Over the following days, Hideaki worked with Kyo to help him understand not just the snake's shadow, but the nature of fear itself. He showed him how fear distorts perception, how it takes small threats and makes them seem enormous, how it turns harmless things into monsters. They did experiments together. In the late afternoon, when the sun was low, they would put various objects on the path and observe their shadows. A small toy mouse cast a shadow that looked like a large rat. A thin branch cast a shadow that looked like a serpent. A butterfly landing on a stone cast a shadow that seemed to flutter and pulse menacingly. "Everything looks more threatening in shadow," Hideaki explained. "And fear puts everything in shadow. When you're afraid, your mind sees threats everywhere. It exaggerates the size of dangers. It interprets ambiguous things as dangerous. It casts everything in the worst possible light, just like this low sun casts everything in exaggerated shadow." Kyo was beginning to understand. "So when I'm afraid, I see shadows instead of real things." "Exactly," his grandfather said. "The fear came first, from the stories you heard, from the ideas you had about snakes being dangerous. Then, because you were already afraid, when you saw something that could be a snake, your fear made it look as threatening as possible. The shadow confirmed what you already feared. But it wasn't showing you reality, it was showing you your fear." They began a daily practice. Each afternoon, when the shadows were long, Kyo would go into the garden with his grandfather. They would look for the snake, and when they found it, they would observe both the snake and its shadow. Kyo would practice seeing them as separate things: the actual snake, small and harmless, and the shadow, which could be large or small depending on the light and angle. Slowly, over weeks, Kyo's fear began to diminish. He learned to check his first perception. When something looked threatening, he would ask himself, "Am I seeing the thing itself, or am I seeing its shadow? Am I responding to actual danger, or to fear's distortion of reality?" One day, Kyo was in the garden alone when he saw the snake. His first impulse was still fear, that instant clench of his heart, that flash of terror. But now, he had tools to work with that fear. He stopped, took a breath, and looked more carefully. The snake was small, as it had always been. It was moving slowly through the lettuce, eating small insects. Its shadow in the bright midday sun was tiny and non-threatening. There was nothing here to fear. The actual snake was harmless. The shadow his fear had been casting was the real threat. Kyo didn't run. He watched the snake for several minutes, observing its gentle movements, the way it went about its business without any attention to him. He felt his fear dissolving, replaced by curiosity, and even a kind of appreciation. This creature was part of the garden's ecosystem, helpful and harmless. When he told his grandfather about this encounter, Hideaki smiled with deep satisfaction. "You've learned something that will serve you far beyond this garden," he said. "You've learned to distinguish between actual threats and the shadows that fear casts. Most of what frightens us in life is shadows, not substance." As Kyo grew older, he found this lesson applied to many areas of his life. When he was worried about starting at a new school, he recognized that his fear was casting shadows, making the unknown seem more threatening than it actually was. When he was anxious about speaking in front of his class, he understood that his imagination was creating enormous shadows of embarrassment and failure that were far larger than any actual consequence. He learned to ask himself the questions his grandfather had taught him. What is the actual thing I'm afraid of? How big is it really? And how much of what I'm seeing is the shadow cast by my own fear? Years later, when Kyo was a young man, he returned to his grandfather's garden. The old snake had long since died, but its descendants still lived there, keeping the garden healthy. Kyo could watch them without fear, even appreciate their elegant movements and their important role in the garden's balance. A neighbor's child was visiting, a little girl who was terrified of the snakes. She screamed when she saw one, just as Kyo had done years before. And Kyo found himself repeating his grandfather's lesson, showing her how the afternoon sun cast long shadows, demonstrating how fear makes small things look huge. "The shadow is not the thing," he told her, using the same words his grandfather had used with him. "Your fear shows you shadows and tells you they're real. But if you look more carefully, if you change your angle, if you step closer, you'll see the actual thing is much smaller than its shadow suggests." He showed her the small snake, harmless and gentle, and then its exaggerated shadow in the late afternoon light. He helped her understand that she had been responding to the shadow of her own fear, not to any actual danger. Hideaki, now very old, watched this teaching being passed down and felt deep satisfaction. This was wisdom that could transform a life. The understanding that fear distorts perception, that we so often respond to shadows rather than reality, that most of what terrifies us is an exaggeration created by our own minds. One evening, Hideaki and Kyo sat together in the garden as the sun set, casting long shadows across everything. "You know," Hideaki said, "I've been thinking about this teaching we've shared, about snakes and shadows. It goes even deeper than I first realized." "How so?" Kyo asked. "Well, we talk about how fear creates shadows that make things look bigger than they are. But there's another side to it. Sometimes we need to see our own shadows, the parts of ourselves we're afraid of or ashamed of. We spend so much energy trying to hide our shadows, pretending they don't exist, that we never really look at them. And anything we refuse to look at has power over us." He pointed to their own shadows, stretched long in the setting sun. "Your shadow is part of you. You can't separate from it, but it's not you. It's just the outline you cast, the space you block from the light. The same is true of our inner shadows, our fears and flaws, and the parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge. They're part of us, but they're not all of us, and they only look monstrous when we refuse to look at them directly." Kyo thought about this. So the lesson works both ways? Don't be afraid of shadows outside you because they're not as dangerous as they look. But also, don't be afraid of shadows inside you because they're just aspects of yourself, not monsters. "Exactly," Hideaki said. "Fear makes everything look worse than it is, whether it's a snake in the garden or a flaw in your own character. The solution is the same. Look directly at the thing itself, not at the shadow your fear is casting. When you look directly, with courage and honesty, you almost always find that the reality is more manageable than the shadow suggested." As night fell and the shadows merged into general darkness, Kyo reflected on all he had learned from one small garden snake and its shadow. The lesson had grown and deepened over the years, revealing new layers of meaning. What had started as a child's fear of a harmless creature had become a profound understanding about the nature of fear itself, about perception and reality, about how our minds create the very threats we're most afraid of. The garden snake, living its simple life among the vegetables, had been an unlikely teacher. But then Kyo had learned the best teachers often come in unexpected forms. Sometimes wisdom arrives not through grand revelations, but through small moments of noticing, through paying attention to shadows and light, through an old grandfather's patient guidance, and a child's eventual willingness to look more closely at what he feared. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what shadows you've been seeing. What fears in your life are casting exaggerated shadows, making things seem more threatening than they actually are? What worries have you been responding to as if they were huge and dangerous, when they might be quite small if you looked at them directly? Fear has a way of taking the unknown, the uncertain, the potentially difficult, and casting it in the worst possible light. Every ambiguous situation becomes threatening. Every challenge looks insurmountable. Every risk seems catastrophic. But these are shadows, distortions created by the angle of your perception and the intensity of your fear. What if you could see your fears in bright midday light instead of the exaggerated shadows of anxiety? What if you stepped closer to examine them, the way Kyo learned to approach the snake instead of running from it? you might find that the actual thing is much smaller, much less threatening than the shadow suggested. And what about the shadows within you? The parts of yourself you judge harshly, the flaws you try to hide, the aspects of your personality or your history that you're ashamed of. These cast shadows too. They look monstrous when you refuse to look at them, when you let fear tell you how terrible they are. But when you turn toward them with courage, when you examine them directly instead of avoiding them, you often find they're just human, just part of being alive, just aspects of yourself that need acknowledgement, not judgment. Rest now in the understanding that most of what frightens you is shadow, not substance. Your fears are real, yes, but what you fear is often an exaggeration, a distortion, an illusion created by poor lighting and unfortunate angles. The actual challenges you face are manageable. The real you beneath all the shadows is capable and whole. The darkness you're afraid of is just the absence of light, and light returns with each morning. Let your fears cast their shadows if they must. You don't have to fight them or deny them. Just recognize them for what they are, shadows, not the things themselves, and know that shadows, no matter how large or dark or menacing they appear, cannot hurt you. They're just shapes in the absence of light. They have no substance. They cannot touch you. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that the monsters are shadows, and the shadows will shrink when you bring them into the light of honest attention. You are not your fears. You are not the shadows those fears cast. You are the awareness that can see both the thing and its shadow, that can distinguish between actual danger and exaggerated perception, that can step closer and discover again and again that what looked huge from a distance is quite small up close. Rest in this truth. The garden snake is just a small creature that eats insects. The shadow was just a shadow. And you are safe. You've always been safe. The threat was never as large as it looked. It never is. With each step on the Zen path, a new lesson unfolds. Now we turn to a story about recognition, of self, of others, and of what truly matters. Listen carefully to the next story. In a village rebuilding after a great earthquake, there was a master mason named Takeo who was known throughout the region for building walls that followed precise specifications. Every stone placed according to traditional methods, every measurement exact, every joint perfect. His walls were architectural achievements, admired by other masons and praised in the capital. When the earthquake struck and buildings collapsed throughout the region, everyone expected Takeo's walls to stand as a testament to proper craftsmanship. Instead, most of his carefully built walls fell. The perfect joints fractured. The precisely placed stones tumbled. All that meticulous work reduced to rubble. But there was one wall that remained standing, and it puzzled everyone. It was a wall that Takeo's apprentice, a young man named Jiro, had built in the early days of his training. The wall wasn't straight. It curved and bent in unusual ways. The stones weren't uniform or perfectly fitted. By every standard of proper masonry, the wall was wrong. Takeo had been embarrassed by it, had planned to tear it down and rebuild it properly, but had never gotten around to it. Now that the crooked, imperfect wall stood while all of Takeo's masterpieces lay in ruins. After the earthquake, people would visit that wall, marveling at how something so improperly built had survived when everything correct had fallen. Takeo was humbled and confused. He went to examine the crooked wall carefully, trying to understand what accidental wisdom it contained. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about his craft. The wall's curves and bends, which he had seen as flaws, had actually allowed it to flex during the earthquake, rather than rigidly resisting the force. The imperfect joints had given the structure some ability to shift without completely fracturing. The irregular stones had created a kind of organic stability that precise, uniform stones couldn't achieve. "I built this wall wrong," Jiro said when he and Takeo examined it together. "I was new. I didn't know the proper methods yet. I just placed stones in ways that felt stable." "You built it intuitively," Takeo replied slowly, "while I built with rigid adherence to rules. Your intuition understood something about forces and flexibility that the traditional methods don't account for. The rules made sense for normal conditions, but they weren't designed for extreme stress. Your ignorance of the rules allowed you to respond to the actual needs of the situation." An engineer from the capital came to study the surviving wall. He measured its curves, examined its composition, and tried to understand its principles. "This wall shouldn't have stood," he said finally. "By every calculation, every principle of proper construction, it should have fallen. But clearly, our principles are incomplete. This wall knows something we don't." Takeo spent months studying not just Jiro's wall, but other structures that had survived. He found a pattern. The buildings that stood weren't always the ones built most correctly. Often, they were the ones with irregular features, with imperfections that accidentally created flexibility. The traditional methods, designed over centuries for stable conditions, weren't necessarily best for extreme conditions. He began incorporating these insights into his new work. He still used traditional methods as a foundation, but he added intentional irregularities, curves instead of straight lines, flexible joints instead of rigid joints of rigid ones, and organic shapes instead of perfect geometry. Other masons criticized him. "You're violating the principles," they said. "You're building incorrectly." "I'm building for survival rather than for appearance," Takeo replied. The old principles were based on aesthetic ideals and normal conditions. "I'm building for abnormal conditions based on what actually survived when everything else fell." His new walls looked less impressive than his old ones. They weren't as straight, as precise, as aesthetically pleasing. But when another earthquake struck years later, these walls stood. The traditional walls, built by masons who still adhered to the old, correct methods, fell again. Takeo's irregular, imperfect walls flexed and bent and survived. "What's more important?" Takeo asked his critics. "Building correctly according to traditional standards, or building what actually works?" "My old walls were perfect and dead. My new walls are imperfect and alive." He trained a new generation of masons in what he called flexible building. They learned the traditional methods, but also learned when to deviate from them, when to trust intuition over rules, and when to value survival over correctness. "The crooked wall saved my life," Takeo would tell students. "Not just physically, by remaining standing during the earthquake, but professionally and spiritually, by taught me that correctness isn't the same as truth." Something can be done exactly right according to established principles and still fail when conditions change. And something can be done wrong and still succeed because it responds to actual conditions rather than theoretical ideals. One student asked, "So should we ignore all the traditional methods?" "No," Takeo replied. "Learn them, understand them, but don't worship them. Rules are tools, not truths. They work until they don't. The crooked wall taught me to pay attention to what actually works rather than what should work according to theory. Sometimes the imperfect, the irregular, the supposedly wrong thing contains wisdom that perfection misses." He would take students to see Jiro's wall, still standing decades after the earthquake that revealed its value. "This wall is a better teacher than any master mason," he would say. "It teaches that survival often comes from flexibility rather than rigidity, from imperfection that allows adaptation rather than perfection that allows no variation. It teaches that what's wrong by one standard might be right by a more important standard." The wall became something of a shrine. People would visit it, touch it, and remember that sometimes what appears to be failure or imperfection is actually hidden success. That correctness and effectiveness aren't always the same thing. That rules have limits, and intuition has wisdom. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the crooked walls in your life, the things you've done imperfectly, irregularly, against the rules or proper methods. Perhaps these apparent flaws are actually what allowed you to survive when others who did everything correctly fell apart. Perhaps your imperfections are flexibilities that rigid perfection lacks. You don't have to do everything correctly. You don't have to follow every rule or meet every standard. Sometimes the crooked wall stands when the straight wall falls. Sometimes your irregular, imperfect, supposedly wrong way of doing things is actually what works best for the conditions you're actually in, rather than the ideal conditions that rules assume. Rest now in acceptance of your crooked walls. They may not look perfect. They may not meet conventional standards, but they've kept you standing when straight walls would have crumbled. Your imperfections aren't failures. They're flexible, and flexibility is what allows survival when everything rigid breaks. The crooked wall knows this. Now you know it too. There was a calligrapher named Setsuko who took great pride in her work. She would spend hours creating each character, each stroke perfect, each piece a work of art that she expected would last for generations. One day, she acquired a special ink that a merchant had brought from a distant province. The ink created beautiful deep blacks and flowed perfectly from her brush. But she soon discovered it had an unusual property. It never fully dried. Even days after she had finished a piece, the ink remained slightly wet. If you touched it, even carefully, it would smudge. At first, Setsuko was furious. She couldn't sell work that would smudge. She couldn't give pieces as gifts, knowing they would be ruined by the first careless touch. All her effort was going into work that couldn't be preserved. She tried everything to make the ink dry properly, but nothing worked. Finally, in frustration, she went to the merchant who had sold it to her, demanding her money back. The merchant looked surprised, but that's the nature of this ink. I told you it was special. Special? It's defective. It won't dry. Exactly, the merchant said. It's teaching ink. It reminds you that nothing you create is permanent. Your beautiful calligraphy will eventually fade, whether from age or damage or fire. This ink just makes the impermanence more obvious. Setsuko went home angry, but she couldn't stop thinking about the merchant's words. Everything she created would eventually be destroyed. The ink that wouldn't dry was just being honest about what was true of all her work. She began to approach her calligraphy differently. Instead of creating pieces meant to last forever, she started creating pieces meant for the moment. She would write on large papers and hang them in her studio, knowing they would slowly smudge and blur over time. She found this liberating. Each piece was perfect for now, and its eventual deterioration was part of its nature, not a tragedy. She began inviting people to come and breathe near her work, to let their breath slowly alter the still wet ink. The pieces became collaborations with time and circumstance, always changing, never fixed. "I was trying to create permanent beauty," she told a student, "but permanence doesn't exist. Everything changes. This ink taught me to make peace with that, to create beauty that's beautiful right now, without needing it to last forever." Tonight, what are you trying to make permanent that was always meant to change? What are you clinging to as if you could freeze it in time? Everything you love, everything you create, everything you are, it's all like ink that won't quite dry. Always shifting, always changing, always vulnerable to smudging. This isn't a tragedy. It's just the nature of existence. Let go of needing things to be permanent. Enjoy them while they're here. Create them knowing they'll change. Love them knowing they'll pass. The impermanence isn't the problem. Your fight against impermanence is. Rest now in the acceptance that nothing lasts forever, and that's what makes this moment precious. In a mountain village famous for its textiles, there was a master weaver named Chio who created cloth of extraordinary beauty. Her patterns were intricate, her colors perfectly balanced, her technique flawless. People would travel for days to commission work from her loom, and her pieces hung in the homes of nobles throughout the province. Then, one winter morning, Chio woke to find her hands had stiffened with arthritis. The pain was intense, but worse was the loss of the fine motor control that her craft demanded. She could no longer work the shuttle with her usual precision. The delicate adjustments that created her signature patterns were now impossible. For a weaver, this seemed like a death sentence. Chio's entire identity, her life's work, her purpose, all depended on her hands. Now those hands betrayed her, refusing to do what she commanded. She sat before her loom for hours, weeping, unable to imagine a future without her craft. Days turned to weeks. The loom sat silent. Chio refused visitors, refused commissions, refused to even look at the beautiful threads that had once brought her such joy. Her apprentice, a young woman named Nao, came regularly, begging Chio to teach her, to at least pass on knowledge if she could no longer create. But Chio sent her away each time. "What's the point?" she would say. "Without my hands, I have nothing to teach. I am nothing." One day, Nao arrived with a request that Chio couldn't refuse. A small child from the village was sick, and his mother had asked if Chio might weave even a simple cloth for the child's comfort. "She doesn't expect your fine work," Nao said gently. "She just wants something made by you, even if it's rough. She believes your cloth has healing in it." Chio couldn't say no to a sick child, So she returned to her loom for the first time in months. Her stiff hands struggled with the shuttle. The tension was uneven. The pattern she attempted came out distorted. Everything her hands produced now was clumsy, imperfect, wrong. But she continued, driven by compassion for the child. She created a simple blanket, nothing like her former masterpieces. The weave was loose, the pattern irregular, the whole piece marked by the limitations of her arthritic hands. She wrapped it with shame, certain the mother would be disappointed. When Nao delivered the blanket, the mother held it and began to cry. "It's perfect," she said. "Tell Chio it's the most beautiful thing she's ever made." Nao brought this message back to Chio, who couldn't believe it. How could that rough, imperfect work be beautiful? "It's everything I spent my life learning not to create." The mother said she could feel the struggle in it, Nao reported. She said she could feel your hands fighting to create something despite the pain. She said it reminded her that beautiful things can emerge from difficulty, that limitation doesn't mean the end of creation. Her child is struggling too, and she said this cloth would remind him that struggle can still produce beauty. This response shook something loose in Chio's understanding. She had thought beauty required perfection, that her arthritic hands could only produce inferior work. But this mother had seen a different kind of beauty, the beauty of creation despite limitation, of persistence through difficulty, of love expressed through imperfect means. Chio returned to her loom with a new perspective. She stopped trying to create what her hands could no longer produce and started exploring what they could produce. The patterns that emerged were unlike anything she had made before. They were asymmetrical, organic, and marked by the randomness of her unpredictable hand movements. They told stories of struggle and adaptation, of beauty that included, rather than denied, imperfection. People noticed something profound in this new work. Her earlier pieces had been technically superior, but these new pieces touched something deeper. They were relatable in a way perfection never is. They spoke of being human, of limitations, of finding beauty not despite obstacles, but through them. "Your old work was impressive," one patron told her. "This new work is moving. I look at your perfect pieces and admire them. I look at these new pieces and feel understood." Chio began teaching again, but with a transformed philosophy. "I spent 30 years pursuing perfection," she would tell students. "I thought my value as a weaver came from my technical mastery. But arthritis stripped that away and showed me something more important. That beauty doesn't require perfection. That limitation can reveal new possibilities. That the work of imperfect hands can touch hearts in ways that perfect technique never could." She would show students her early work alongside her later work. "These first pieces show what skilled hands can do. These later pieces show what love can do with whatever hands you have. Which is more valuable?" The answer isn't obvious. Nao, who had continued as her apprentice through all these changes, asked one day, "Do you wish you could have your old hands back? Do you miss being able to create perfectly?" Chio thought for a long time before answering. "I miss the ease of it," she said honestly. "I miss not feeling pain with every movement, but I don't miss who I was when perfection came easily." That Chio was skilled but narrow. She understood only one kind of beauty. This Chio, with her stiff, painful hands, understands more. The arthritis took my technical perfection, but it gave me depth I never had before. She held up her gnarled hands. These hands taught me what my young, nimble hands never could, that obstacles refine what truly matters. When I could create anything, I created what was impressive. Now that I can only create with difficulty, I create what's true. The limitations stripped away everything superficial and left only what's essential. Years passed, and Chio's hands grew worse. Eventually, she could barely work the loom at all. But by then, her teaching had become as valued as her weaving once was. She taught people to see obstacles not as endings, but as refinements, not as barriers, but as editors that remove what's unnecessary and reveal what's essential. Every limitation is a teacher, she would say. It shows you what really matters by taking away what doesn't. My hands took away my technical mastery and revealed that mastery was never the point. The point was always connection, expression, and the creation of beauty that touches hearts. I can do that with arthritic hands. I just had to learn a different language of beauty. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own limitations, your own obstacles, your own arthritic hands. What has been taken from you that felt essential? What can you no longer do that once defined you? These losses aren't just subtractions. They're refinements, removing what's superficial to reveal what's essential. Your obstacles are teaching you something. They're stripping away the easy answers, the impressive exteriors, the technical perfections that never touched anyone's heart anyway. What remains, what you can still do despite your limitations, that's what truly matters. That's where your real beauty lives. Rest now in acceptance of your arthritic hands, your imperfect instruments, your limited capacities. They're not preventing beauty. They're refining it, teaching it, revealing it in forms you never would have discovered through ease and perfection. The weaver's silent loom eventually spoke with more power than her perfect one ever did. Your limitations will teach you the same truth if you let them. As our exploration of Zen Buddhism deepens, let us listen to a story that reveals how true worth is often overlooked. Here starts the next story. There was a ship's navigator named Takeshi who prided himself on never losing his way. He had sailed the coastal waters for 20 years, and in all that time, he had never once deviated from his intended course. He relied on a compass that had been given to him by his father, a master navigator, and this compass had never failed him. Takeshi's confidence in his navigational abilities was absolute. He knew exactly where he was at all times, could calculate his position by the stars, by the currents, by the wind. His captain trusted him completely, and other sailors spoke of Takeshi as someone who could navigate through the darkest night or the heaviest fog without ever being uncertain of his position. But one day, during what should have been a routine voyage along a familiar coast, something happened that shattered Takeshi's certainty. His compass began behaving strangely. The needle wavered, spun unpredictably, and then stopped working entirely. When Takeshi tried to get his bearings from the stars, heavy clouds covered the sky. The familiar landmarks he usually used were hidden by an unusual mist. For the first time in 20 years, Takeshi was lost. His initial reaction was panic. Without his compass, without his usual reference points, he felt completely disoriented. The ship was still moving, but he had no confidence in the direction they were heading. Every decision felt uncertain. Should they continue forward or turn back? Should they anchor and wait for the fog to clear, or try to push through? The captain came to find him. "Takeshi, what's our position?" "I don't know," Takeshi admitted, the words painful to say. "My compass is broken. I can't see the stars. The landmarks are hidden. Captain, I'm lost." The captain was quiet for a moment, then said something unexpected. "Good. Maybe now you'll actually see where we are." Takeshi was confused. "But I don't know where we are." "That's the problem. You've sailed these waters for 20 years, the captain said. You've relied on your instruments and your calculations. But have you ever really looked at the water itself? Have you ever paid attention to how it feels to sail through it, rather than just measuring your position within it?" The captain walked to the rail and looked out at the misty water. "When I started sailing, I had no instruments. I learned to read the water, the wind, the subtle signs that told me where I was and where I was going. You've always had your compass, so you never develop that sense. Maybe being lost is your opportunity to find a different way of knowing." Takeshi wanted to argue, but the truth was they had no choice. The compass was broken, and no amount of worry would fix it. He would have to navigate without his primary tool, without the certainty he had always relied on. So he began to pay attention in ways he never had before. He noticed the color of the water, which changed subtly with depth and seafloor composition. He felt the temperature of the wind on his face, which varied based on what land masses it had passed over. He watched the patterns of seabirds, which could indicate proximity to shore. He listened to the sound of the waves against the hull, which changed depending on bottom depth and current patterns. All of these signs had always been there. He just had never needed to notice them because his compass had told him everything he thought he needed to know. Now, forced to rely on more subtle indicators, he discovered a whole language of navigation he had been blind to. After several hours of this intense attention, Takeshi realized something. He had a sense of where they were, not the precise, measured certainty his compass had provided, but a felt sense, an intuitive knowing based on multiple subtle cues. It wasn't as comfortable as the false certainty his compass had given him, but it felt more real, more connected to the actual experience of being on the water. He gave the captain his best estimate of their position and the direction they should sail. "Are you sure?" the captain asked. "No," Takeshi admitted, "but I'm not completely lost either. I'm somewhere in between, navigating by feel rather than by certainty." They sailed based on Takeshi's intuitive navigation. Several hours later, when the fog finally cleared, they discovered they were exactly where Takeshi had estimated, perhaps even more accurately positioned than if he had been rigidly following his compass bearing. A Zen monk was traveling on the ship, making a pilgrimage to a distant temple. He had watched Takeshi's struggle with interest. That evening, he approached the navigator. "You've learned something valuable today," the monk said. "I've learned that I've been overly dependent on my tools," Takeshi replied. "That's a humbling lesson." "More than that," the monk said, "you've learned that there are different kinds of knowing. The compass gave you one kind, precise, measurable, certain, but it was a narrow knowing. It told you your position, but nothing about the water you were moving through, the wind you were sailing on, the life of the ocean around you. He looked out at the darkening water. When you lost that narrow certainty, you found a broader knowing. Less precise perhaps, but more connected, more alive, more responsive to what's actually happening rather than what should be happening according to your instruments. Takeshi thought about this. But isn't certainty important? Don't we need to know where we are? There are different kinds of certainty, the monk replied. The compass gave you the certainty of measurement. But measurement isn't the same as understanding. Today, without your compass, you develop the certainty of relationship. You know where you are not because an instrument tells you, but because you're in relationship with the water, the wind, the birds, all the subtle signs. This kind of knowing is less precise but more intimate. Over the following days, even after Takeshi had replaced his broken compass with a new one, he found himself relying on it less. He had discovered that he could navigate by reading the signs around him, by paying attention to subtle cues, by trusting his felt sense of position and direction. The compass was useful for confirmation, but he no longer needed it as his primary tool. Other navigators noticed the change in Takeshi's approach. He seemed more relaxed, more connected to the sailing itself, rather than anxiously checking his instruments every few minutes. Younger navigators would ask him for advice. The most important thing, Takeshi would tell them, is to not become so dependent on your tools that you lose your own capacity to sense and understand. Tools are useful, compasses are valuable. But if you rely on them exclusively, you become helpless when they fail. And more than that, you miss the actual experience of navigating, of being in relationship with the water you're moving through. He would tell them about the day his compass broke. I thought I was lost, and in one way I was. I had lost my usual certainty, my measured precision. But in another way, I found something I had been missing for 20 years. I found direct contact with the elements I was navigating through. I found a different kind of knowing that doesn't come from instruments but from attention and relationship. One young navigator asked, "But what if you're wrong? What if you follow your intuition and it leads you astray?" That can happen, Takeshi admitted. Just as following a compass can lead you astray if the compass is broken or if there's magnetic interference you don't know about. No method is perfect. But when you're navigating by attention and relationship, you notice when things don't feel right. You can adjust. When you're blindly following an instrument, you might sail confidently in the wrong direction without realizing it until it's too late. Years passed, and Takeshi's reputation changed. Instead of being known as the navigator who never lost his way, he became known as the navigator who could find his way even when lost. People understood there was a difference, and the second reputation was actually more valuable. A merchant who hired Takeshi for a difficult voyage once asked him, "What happens if we get lost?" Takeshi smiled. "We probably will get lost at some point. Weather changes, conditions shift, instruments fail. But being lost isn't the problem. Staying lost is the problem. And I've learned how to find my way even when the usual markers are gone. Being lost has become part of how I navigate, not something I try to prevent at all costs." The voyage was indeed difficult, with unexpected storms and compass problems. But Takeshi navigated through all of it, sometimes with certainty, sometimes with intuition, sometimes acknowledging that he wasn't sure but making his best estimate based on all available information. The ship arrived safely and the merchant was impressed. "You seem comfortable with uncertainty," the merchant observed. "I've learned to be," Takeshi replied. "Certainty is valuable when you can have it, but most of life involves some degree of uncertainty, some degree of not knowing exactly where you are or where you're going. The question is whether that uncertainty paralyzes you or whether you can navigate through it, using whatever signs are available, trusting your judgment, adjusting as you go." He looked out at the harbor where they had docked. "That day my compass broke was one of the most important days of my sailing life. It forced me to develop capacities I had been neglecting. It taught me that there are many ways of knowing, and the most precise isn't always the most useful. It showed me that being lost can be the beginning of finding a better way." The merchant nodded thoughtfully. "I think I've been sailing through my business life the same way you used to sail, following my instruments, my plans, my certainties. And when things don't go according to plan, when my compass breaks, I panic. Maybe I need to learn what you learned." "Maybe you do," Takeshi agreed. "Maybe we all do. Because life is going to break our compasses. It's going to take away our certainties and our familiar reference points. The question is whether we fall apart when that happens, or whether we discover we have other capacities, other ways of knowing, other methods of finding our way. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what compasses have broken in your life. What certainties have you lost? What familiar reference points are no longer available? These losses can feel frightening, disorienting, like being lost at sea without navigation tools. But what if being lost isn't the disaster you think it is? What if it's an opportunity to develop new capacities, to discover ways of knowing and navigating that you've been neglecting? What if the broken compass is forcing you to pay attention in new ways, to trust senses you've been ignoring, to find your way through relationship and intuition rather than measurement and certainty? You don't need to know exactly where you are right now. You don't need perfect clarity about your direction. You're not lost in a catastrophic sense. You're just navigating without your usual instruments, which means you have to pay attention more closely, trust yourself more deeply, be more present to subtle signs and signals. Rest in the uncertainty tonight. Let yourself not know. Let yourself be somewhere between lost and found, navigating by feel, trusting that you have capacities beyond your usual tools. The compass will break sometimes. That's not failure. That's life inviting you to find a different way, a deeper way, a way that connects you more intimately with the journey itself. You know more than you think you know. You can find your way even when you can't measure your position. Being lost is just another form of navigation, one that requires more attention, more presence, more trust. And sometimes, being lost leads you to places you never would have discovered if you had stayed on your carefully plotted course. Sleep now in the uncertainty. You don't need a compass to rest. You don't need to know where you are to be okay right here. Let yourself drift without reference points, trusting that you'll find your way when morning comes, not through certainty, but through attention, not through instruments, but through relationship with whatever each moment brings. Continuing along the path of Zen insight, We pause now to hear a teaching about perception and hidden value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a coastal village where dangerous rocks lurked beneath the waves, there stood a lighthouse that had saved countless ships from destruction. The lighthouse keeper was a man named Tomo, who had tended the light faithfully for 20 years, never missing a night, never letting the beacon fail. Tomo took great pride in his work. Each evening as he lit the lamp, he would think about the ships that would see his light and know where the safe passage lay. He imagined grateful sailors steering clear of the rocks because of his vigilance. His purpose was clear, his contribution visible, his worth measured in ships that arrived safely rather than wrecking on the shore. But then came a period in Tomo's life when everything fell apart. His wife died after a long illness. His adult son, with whom he'd been close, moved to a distant city and rarely wrote. His closest friend in the village passed away suddenly. Within the span of 6 months, Tomo lost everyone who mattered most to him. He fell into a deep despair. He no longer felt the satisfaction he once had in his work. The lighthouse seemed meaningless, his life empty, his purpose hollow. He felt lost, as if he were stumbling through darkness with no light to guide him, no sense of direction, no hope that things would improve. Yet, despite his inner darkness, Tomo continued to light the lighthouse every night. It was a habit, a duty, the automatic continuation of what he had always done. But there was no joy in it anymore, no sense of meaning. He lit the lamp because that's what lighthouse keepers do, not because he felt it mattered. He would stand in the lamp room at night, watching the light sweep across the dark water, and think, I'm supposed to be the one providing light, but I'm drowning in darkness. I'm supposed to guide others to safety, but I'm completely lost in myself. What right do I have to stand here pretending to know the way when I can't find my own path? One stormy night, as Tomo stood in the lamp room feeling particularly hopeless, there was a knock at the lighthouse door. He descended to find a sailor, soaking wet, nearly hypothermic, who had been thrown from his ship when a wave swept over the deck. I saw your light, the sailor gasped as Tomo pulled him inside. I was in the water, being pulled toward the rocks. I thought I was going to die. Then I saw your light, and I swam toward it. Your light saved my life. Tomo brought the man warm clothes, hot tea, and blankets. As the sailor recovered by the fire, he kept repeating his gratitude. If your light hadn't been there, I would have been smashed against the rocks. I couldn't see anything else, but I could see your light. It showed me which way to swim. After the sailor left the next morning, rescued by his ship, which had returned looking for him, Tomo sat for a long time thinking about what had happened. He had been so focused on his own inner darkness that he had forgotten what his light actually did. It didn't require him to feel enlightened. It didn't need him to be free of darkness himself. It just needed to shine. The sailor didn't care that the lighthouse keeper was lost and grieving. The sailor didn't need Tomo to have all the answers or to be living a perfect life. The sailor just needed the light to be there, marking the safe passage, showing where the dangers were. A Zen monk who lived at the village had heard about the rescued sailor. He came to visit Tomo at the lighthouse. I've noticed you've been struggling, the monk said gently. Since your losses, I see the darkness in you. Tomo nodded, too tired to pretend otherwise. I light this beacon every night, but I feel like a fraud. How can I guide others when I'm lost myself? How can I provide light when I'm full of darkness? The monk looked up at the lamp tower. Does the lighthouse need to understand navigation to be useful? Does it need to have sailed all the seas to show where the rocks are? Does it need to feel happy and fulfilled to save lives? No, Tomo admitted. It just needs to shine. Exactly, the monk said. You think your inner darkness disqualifies you from helping others, but actually, your willingness to keep the light burning despite your darkness makes your service even more valuable. You're not helping others because you have everything figured out. You're helping them because you do what needs to be done, regardless of how you feel. He touched Tomo's shoulder. Many people believe they can't help others until they're completely healed themselves. Until they've solved all their problems, found all their answers, achieved enlightenment or happiness or wholeness. But if everyone waited until they were completely well before helping others, no one would ever help anyone. We're all broken in some way. We're all stumbling in the darkness of one kind or another, but we can still hold lights for each other. Tomo felt something shift inside him. You're saying I can be lost and still guide others? You already are, the monk replied. You've been doing it every night. Your grief, your despair, your sense of being lost, none of that prevented the light from shining. None of that stopped you from doing what needed to be done. You think you're a fraud because you're suffering while helping others. But actually, you're demonstrating something important. Service doesn't require personal perfection. It requires showing up and doing what needs to be done. Over the following weeks, Tomo began to see his work differently. He was still grieving. He still felt lost much of the time. The darkness inside him hadn't disappeared. But he understood now that his inner state didn't invalidate his outer contribution. Ships still needed guidance. The light still saved lives. His pain didn't make the light less bright. He thought about all the people who probably felt as he did, broken, lost, inadequate, questioning their right to help others when they themselves were struggling. How many people stopped offering their gifts because they felt they weren't whole enough, healed enough, enlightened enough? A young woman from the village came to him one day troubled. She was training to be a healer, but felt overwhelmed by her own anxieties and doubts. How can I help heal others when I'm so broken myself? She asked. Tomo took her up to the lamp room and showed her the light. This lighthouse doesn't need to be whole to be useful. It just needs to do its job. You don't need to have conquered all your fears and healed all your wounds to help others. You just need to offer what you can offer. Your brokenness doesn't disqualify you from service. Sometimes it actually makes you better at it because you understand suffering from the inside. He told her about the sailor he had saved while feeling completely lost. The sailor didn't need me to be happy. He needed me to keep the light on. The people you help won't need you to be perfect. They'll need you to offer your skills, your compassion, your presence, whatever you're capable of giving. And you can give those things even while you're struggling. Word spread about the lighthouse keeper's teaching. People who had been holding back from helping others because of their own problems began to reconsider. The teacher who was battling depression realized she could still teach well, that her students didn't need her to be joyful. just knowledgeable and present. The counselor, struggling with his own failed marriage, recognized he could still help other couples, that his challenges didn't erase his insights. The mentor, dealing with doubt about his own life choices, saw that he could still guide younger people. That uncertainty about his own path didn't prevent him from illuminating options for others. Tomoe's grief gradually softened over time. Years passed, and while he never stopped missing his wife and feeling the absence of his son, the acute pain dulled into a quieter sadness. The darkness inside him became less consuming, but he never forgot the lesson of that period, that he had kept the light burning through his darkest time, that ships had been saved even while he felt lost, that his inner darkness hadn't stopped the outward light. One evening, many years later, an old sailor came to the lighthouse. "Do you remember me?" the sailor asked. "You saved my life 20 years ago. I was thrown overboard in a storm. I saw your light and swam to it." Tomoe did remember. That was the night I needed most to know that what I was doing mattered. "Well, it mattered," the sailor said. "I went on to have a family. 3 children, 7 grandchildren now. All of them exist because you kept that light burning. And you know what I learned that night? I learned that when you're drowning in darkness, you don't need someone who has all the answers. You just need someone who's holding a light, even if they're struggling to hold it, even if they're not sure why they're bothering. You just need the light. It doesn't matter if the keeper is lost. It matters that the light is there." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what lights you've been withholding because you feel too broken to offer them. What help have you refused to give because you don't feel qualified, whole, or enlightened enough? What guidance have you withheld because you yourself feel lost? You don't need to have everything figured out to help someone else. You don't need to be healed completely to offer healing. You don't need to be free of darkness to hold light for others. The lighthouse keeper's inner darkness didn't stop ships from being saved. Your inner struggles don't invalidate the contribution you can make. Keep your light burning, even in your dark nights. Not because you're perfect, but because someone out there is swimming in darkness toward whatever light they can find. Your light might be the one that saves them. And it doesn't matter that you feel lost. It only matters that you're still showing up, still doing what you can do, still offering what you can offer. Rest now in the understanding that you can be broken and still be useful, lost and still guide others, full of darkness and still provides light. The lighthouse doesn't need to understand the journey to mark the safe passage. It just needs to keep shining. So do you. Your inner darkness doesn't disqualify you from helping others. Sometimes it's what qualifies you most, because you understand what it's like to need a light in the darkness. Sleep now, lighthouse keeper, knowing that even in your darkest nights, your light has been saving lives. It always has been. It always will be. In a village where strong winds frequently blew down from the mountains, there was a grove of trees that included many different species. There were tall, rigid pines that stood straight and proud. There were sturdy oaks with thick trunks and strong branches. And among these impressive trees, there grew a single weeping willow, whose branches hung down gracefully, swaying with every breeze. A young carpenter named Riku would come to this grove to select wood for his work. He admired the strong, straight pines and the solid oaks. These were trees that stood firm against the wind, that didn't bend or yield, that maintained their position no matter what the weather came. This, Riku thought, was what strength looked like. The weeping willow he barely noticed, and when he did, he pitied it. Its branches drooped instead of reaching proudly skyward. It swayed and bent with every wind. It seemed weak, yielding, almost pathetic compared to the strong trees around it. Then one year, a great storm came. The wind howled down from the mountains with unprecedented force. The rain fell in sheets. Lightning split the sky. For 3 days and 3 nights, the storm raged. When it finally passed, Riku went to the grove to see what wood might be available from fallen trees. What he found shocked him. The strong pines, so tall and proud, had snapped like twigs. Their rigid trunks had broken under the force of the wind. The sturdy oaks had been uprooted, their strong but inflexible branches torn away. All across the grove lay the wreckage of trees that had stood firm, refused to yield, and had been destroyed for their rigidity. But the weeping willow still stood. Its branches, which had seemed so weak because they bent and swayed, had flexed with the wind rather than breaking against it. The tree that had appeared most fragile had survived when all the apparently strong trees had fallen. Riku sat beside the willow, looking at the destruction around it, trying to understand what he was seeing. Everything he thought he knew about strength was being challenged. The rig had broken. The yielding had survived. An old Buddhist nun named Kei was walking through the grove, surveying the damage from the storm. She saw Riku sitting in confusion and joined him. "The storm taught you something," she said. "I don't understand," Riku replied. "The strong trees broke. The weak ones survived. How can that be?" "You're confusing rigidity with strength," Kei said gently, "and flexibility with weakness. These are not the same things." She touched one of the willow's drooping branches. "This tree looks weak because it bends. But bending is what saved it." The rigid trees fought against the wind, trying to stand firm, refusing to yield. And the wind broke them. The willow didn't fight. It bent with the wind, yielded to forces it couldn't resist, and in that yielding, found the strength to survive. Riku listened carefully as Kei continued. "There's a principle in martial arts called Ju, which means gentleness or flexibility. The idea is that you don't meet force with force. You don't try to be harder than what's hitting you. Instead, you yield. You move with the energy coming at you. You redirect it rather than blocking it. This isn't a weakness. It's a different kind of strength." She gestured to the broken pines. These trees were strong in one way, but their strength was brittle. They could stand firm against normal winds, but when a force greater than their resistance came, they broke. The willow's strength is different. It has no brittleness because it has no rigidity. It can't break because it never stops bending. Over the following weeks, Riku began to see this principle everywhere. He watched how water, soft and yielding, could wear away stone over time. He noticed how the most rigid people in the village were often the most fragile when things didn't go their way. He observed how the people who could adapt and bend were often the ones who survived life's storms most intact. He changed his approach to carpentry. Instead of always seeking the hardest, most rigid woods, he began to appreciate woods with some flexibility, some give. He learned to work with the wood's natural tendencies rather than trying to force it into shapes it didn't want to take. His furniture became known for being both strong and graceful, able to bear weight while having a quality of flow and ease. But the deeper lesson was about how he lived his own life. Riku had always prided himself on being firm in his opinions, rigid in his principles, unwavering in his positions. He thought this made him strong, but he began to realize it made him brittle. When his wife suggested a different approach to something, his first instinct had always been to resist, to stand firm in his original idea. Now he began to consider, what if yielding wasn't losing? What if listening and adjusting weren't weaknesses but wisdom? When a client wanted changes to a piece he was building, instead of rigidly defending his design, he would flex, adapt, and incorporate their ideas. Often, the result was better than what he had planned. His yielding led to better outcomes than his resistance ever had. When life didn't go according to his plans, instead of fighting against reality, insisting things should be different, he began to bend with what was happening, to adapt, to find ways to work with circumstances rather than against them. A young man from the village came to Riku seeking advice. Everyone tells me I need to be strong, to stand firm, to never back down, but I don't feel strong when I do that. I feel brittle, like I'm about to break. Riku took him to see the weeping willow. The tree had grown even larger in the years since the storm, its graceful branches now spreading wide. This tree survived a storm that destroyed every tree around it, Riku said, not because it was harder or more rigid, but because it knew how to yield. Look at how it moves with this breeze. It doesn't fight the wind, it dances with it. He touched one of the branches, pulling it down and watching it spring back when he released it. True strength includes flexibility, the ability to bend without breaking, to yield without collapsing, to adapt without losing your essential nature. The willow yields, but it doesn't uproot. It bends, but it doesn't break. This is a strength that lasts. The young man asked, "But how do you know when to stand firm and when to bend? Don't some things require us to be rigid, to not yield?" "Yes," Riku acknowledged. "The willow has strong roots. It's flexible in its branches, but grounded in its foundation. The key is knowing what's essential and what's not. Your core values, your true nature, these are like the willow's roots. They ground you, but your opinions, your plans, your preferences, these can be like the branches. They can bend, adapt, yield without threatening who you fundamentally are." He gestured to where the oak and pine had once stood. These trees tried to keep everything rigid. Every branch, every position. They couldn't distinguish between what was essential to hold firm and what could be released. So when the great test came, they lost everything. The willow knew what to hold and what to release. It held its roots and released its branches to the wind. That's wisdom. Years later, the weeping willow became a teaching symbol in the village. Parents would bring children to see it, telling them the story of the great storm. Teachers would use it to illustrate the difference between rigidity and strength. Couples in conflict would sit beneath it, reminding themselves that yielding to each other wasn't losing, but creating a relationship that could weather storms. Riku, now an old man, would still visit the willow regularly. He had learned his lesson deeply. His life had brought many storms, many winds that could have broken him if he had stood rigid against them. But he had learned to bend, to yield, to move with forces he couldn't resist. And like the willow, he had survived, even thrived, not despite his flexibility, but because of it. One day, a master carpenter from the capital came to the village seeking Riku's advice. "I'm known for my rigid standards, my unwillingness to compromise," the master said. "But I'm miserable, and my relationships are all strained. People say I should learn from you." Riku took him to the willow. "What do you see?" "A tree with drooping branches. It looks weak." "It's the only tree that survived the great storm. Everything that looked strong broke. This tree that looks weak stood firm, not through rigidity, but through flexibility." He let this sink in before continuing. "Your rigidity feels like strength because you're in control, imposing your will, but it's actually brittleness. When life brings forces stronger than your will, you'll break. Learn to bend. Learn to yield. Not in your core principles, but in your attachment to having everything your way. True mastery includes knowing when to stand firm and when to flow." Tonight, as you rest, notice where you're holding rigid. What positions are you gripping too tightly? What plans are you clinging to that life is asking you to release? Where might you need to be more like the weeping willow, yielding to forces you can't control, bending so you don't break? Strength isn't always about standing firm. Sometimes it's about flowing with what comes. Sometimes the greatest power is in yielding, adapting, and moving with life, rather than against it. The willow survives because it doesn't fight battles it can't win. It bends, knowing that bending isn't breaking. Let yourself bend tonight. Let yourself yield to rest, to uncertainty, to whatever is. Don't be rigid in your expectations of how this should feel or what should happen. Flow like the willow's branches in the wind, trusting that your roots are strong enough to hold you even as you move with forces beyond your control. Yielding isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And tonight, it's the way to deep rest. As we drift deeper into the still waters of Zen, a quiet teaching begins to rise, one that speaks of clarity and of value not always seen. Listen gently now. The next story begins. In a forest where many birds lived, there was one small brown bird that behaved strangely. While all the other birds worked hard building nests, gathering twigs and moss and feathers, creating elaborate homes in preparation for different seasons, this bird built nothing. She would sleep one night in the hollow of a tree, the next night in thick bushes, the next night on a sheltered branch. The other birds gossiped about her. "She's lazy," some said. "She's foolish," others claimed. "Winter will come, or the rainy season, and she'll have no shelter. She'll regret her lack of planning." The brown bird heard these comments but continued her way of living. Each evening, she would look for where to sleep, finding whatever natural shelter was available. Each morning, she would wake, eat, sing, and fly, unburdened by the need to return to any particular place. One spring, a terrible storm came through the forest. The wind howled for 3 days, trees bent and branches broke. Many carefully built nests were destroyed, torn apart by wind or crushed by falling limbs. Birds who had spent weeks constructing elaborate homes watched them disintegrate in hours. After the storm, the forest was full of distressed birds, mourning their lost nests, wondering how they would rebuild, and feeling that their security had been destroyed. But the brown bird was untroubled. The hollow tree where she had slept the night before the storm was now filled with water, so she simply found a dry hollow in a different tree. The bushes she had used the previous week were flattened, so she used different bushes. Her lack of attachment to any particular shelter meant she had lost nothing in the storm. A wise old owl, who had also lost his nest to the storm, noticed this. He approached the brown bird one morning. "I've watched you for years," the owl said, "and I always thought you were improvident, failing to plan for the future. But now I see something different. You have a kind of security that those of us with nests don't have." "What do you mean?" the bird asked. "Our security depends on things," the owl explained. "On nests, on accumulated materials, on particular places. When those things are destroyed, we feel our security is destroyed. But your security doesn't depend on anything or any place. It depends on your ability to find shelter wherever you are. That can't be destroyed by a storm." The bird tilted her head thoughtfully. "I never thought about it that way. I just go where the shelter is. If one place doesn't work, I find another place. It seems simple." "It is simple," the owl agreed. "But it requires something that's actually quite difficult, letting go of attachment to any particular place or thing. Most of us can't do that. We want the security of returning to the same nest, the same tree, the same familiar place. We want to own a piece of the forest. You're content to belong to the whole forest without owning any of it." Over the following weeks, as birds worked to rebuild their nests, some began to notice what the owl had noticed. The brown bird was never without shelter, never anxious about losing her home, never burdened by protecting what she had accumulated. She had a lightness that the nest-building birds lacked. A young bird who was exhausted from gathering materials for her third attempt at building a nest that kept falling apart, asked the brown bird, "Don't you ever want a nest of your own? A place that's yours, that you can return to?" "I have the whole forest," the brown bird replied. "Every hollow tree, every sheltered branch, every thick bush, all of it is available to me. If I claimed one spot as mine, I would have less, not more. I would have one nest instead of countless possibilities." "But what about security?" the young bird persisted. "What about having something solid and permanent?" The brown bird looked at the young bird's partially built nest, already showing signs of the same structural problems that had doomed the previous two attempts. "Is your nest permanent? The storm showed us that nothing we build lasts forever. Everything changes. The tree that's perfect today might fall tomorrow. The branch that seems strong might break. If your security depends on things staying the same, you'll always be afraid." She ruffled her feathers and continued, "My security comes from knowing I can adapt. I can find shelter in many places. I can adjust to changing conditions. I don't need things to stay the same to be okay. That's a kind of security that storms can't destroy." A monk who lived near the forest and fed the birds sometimes would observe them. He heard other humans talk about the brown bird, calling her the foolish one who didn't plan. But he saw something different. "That bird understands Wu Wei," he told visitors. "She flows with circumstances instead of trying to control them. She works with what is instead of clinging to what was. The other birds work very hard to create security, but their security is brittle because it depends on things staying the same. Her security is flexible because it depends on her ability to work with change. He would point to human lives too. We're like the nest-building birds. We accumulate possessions, thinking they'll make us secure. We cling to jobs, relationships, identities, thinking that if we can just keep things from changing, we'll be safe. But everything changes. The storm always comes eventually. And when it does, all that accumulated security can vanish in a day. People would ask him, so should we not plan? Not build, not try to create stability. Build if you want to build, he would reply. Plan if you want to plan. But hold it all lightly. Don't let your security depend on things remaining unchanged. Develop the brown bird skill, the ability to find shelter in new circumstances, to adapt to change, to let go of what's gone and work with what's here. That's real security, not having a nest, having the ability to live without one. Some listeners understood this teaching. They began to hold their possessions more lightly, to see their homes as temporary shelters rather than permanent fortresses, to develop skills and relationships and inner resources that could adapt to changing circumstances rather than relying on things staying the same. Others couldn't hear it. They kept building bigger nests, acquiring more stuff, trying to make themselves so secure that change couldn't touch them. And then they would suffer greatly when the inevitable storms came. The brown bird lived many years in her nestless way. When she finally died, peacefully in a hollow log during a quiet night, the forest birds gathered to remember her. Even the birds who had once mocked her improvidence now spoke of her with respect. She taught us something important, the old owl said. That true security doesn't come from having much, but from needing little. Not from keeping things the same, but from flowing with change. Not from attachment to place, but from being at home everywhere. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own nests. What are you clinging to, thinking it will keep you secure? What are you afraid to lose, believing that losing it would destroy your safety? What if real security came not from accumulating and protecting, but from developing the ability to adapt, to let go, to find shelter in new circumstances? You don't need to own peace to experience it. You don't need to build happiness to feel it. You don't need to nest in any particular circumstance to be okay. Like the brown bird, you can be at home in the whole forest of life, finding rest wherever you are, secure not in things staying the same, but in your to flow with whatever comes. Let go of your nest tonight. You don't need it to rest. The whole forest is yours. Every moment offers shelter if you're not too attached to the shelter of the previous moment. Rest in change. Rest in uncertainty. Rest in the knowing that you can adapt, can find what you need, can be okay without controlling everything. That's real security. And it's lighter than any nest could ever be. In a monastery at the base of a great mountain, students gathered each year to receive teachings from the head monk, a man named Zenkai who was famous for his wisdom. Students would travel from across the country to ask him questions and receive his guidance. One year, a particularly arrogant young scholar arrived. He had studied Buddhism at several temples, read countless sutras, and believed himself quite learned. He came to test Zenkai. to see if this famous teacher truly deserved his reputation. "Master Zenkai," the scholar said, bowing with perfect form but little genuine respect, "I have a question about the teaching of emptiness. In the Heart Sutra, it says that form is emptiness and emptiness is form. But in the Lotus Sutra, there seems to be a different interpretation. How do you reconcile these apparent contradictions?" Zenkai looked at the scholar for a long moment. Then he said, "What color is the mountain?" The scholar was confused by this response, which seemed to have nothing to do with his sophisticated question. "The mountain? It's grey? Brown? I don't see how that's relevant to my question about the sutras." "Look at the mountain more carefully," Zenkai said. "What color is it really?" Irritated, but willing to play along, the scholar looked at the mountain. "It's multiple colors: grey rock, brown earth, green trees, white snow on the peak. But master, this doesn't answer my question about the sutras." "In the morning light," Zenkai continued as if the scholar hadn't spoken, "the mountain appears pink and gold. In the evening light, it turns purple and deep blue. In fog, it vanishes completely. In moonlight, it becomes silver. So what color is the mountain?" "It depends on the light, the weather, the time of day," the scholar said impatiently. "But surely you're not suggesting that we ignore the profound philosophical questions raised by the sutras in favor of simple observations about scenery." "I'm suggesting," Zenkai said gently, "that you're asking the wrong question. Or rather, you're asking the right question in the wrong way. You want me to give you an intellectually satisfying answer about emptiness that you can add to your collection of knowledge. But emptiness is not a concept to understand. It's a reality to experience." He stood up. "Come with me." Zenkai led the scholar outside and had him sit facing the mountain. "Stay here until you understand the mountain's answer," he said, and walked away. The scholar sat, confused and annoyed. This was not what he had come for. He wanted sophisticated discourse, not this simple sitting and looking. But Zenkai had set the task, and the scholar's pride wouldn't let him give up without trying. He sat there for hours, looking at the mountain. At first, his mind was full of arguments and analysis. He thought about the various sutras, about philosophical positions, about how he would describe this waste of time to his friends at the university. But as the hours passed, something shifted. The afternoon light changed. Clouds moved across the peak. A bird flew past. The mountain simply was, doing nothing, proving nothing, arguing nothing. It had no opinion about emptiness or form. It wasn't trying to be right or wrong. It was just mountain, completely present, completely itself. And sitting there, the scholar's busy mind began to quiet. His need to be right, to demonstrate his knowledge, to prove his intelligence, all of it started to seem less important. He was just a person sitting, looking at a mountain. No questions to answer, no position to defend. Just this moment of being present. As evening came, Zenkai returned. "Did the mountain answer your question?" The scholar was surprised to find he had tears in his eyes. "The mountain showed me that I was so busy being right that I'd forgotten how to simply be. I could quote sutras about emptiness, but I wasn't empty. I was full of myself, full of my knowledge, full of my need to demonstrate my understanding. The mountain doesn't try to understand itself, it just is. And in that isness, there's a kind of wisdom that all my study never touched." Zenkai nodded. You came here with the right answer to your question already prepared. You just wanted me to confirm it so you could feel superior. But I gave you a wrong answer, an irrelevant response about the color of a mountain, and that wrong answer taught you more than my right answer ever could. How so? The scholar asked. Because it frustrated your expectations. It pulled you out of your intellectual comfort zone. It made you sit with uncertainty and not knowing. It brought you into direct contact with reality instead of concepts about reality. Being right keeps you in your head. Being wrong, being confused, not knowing. These open you to actually learning something. The scholar stayed at the monastery for 3 months, not as a scholar testing a teacher, but as a genuine student. And during that time, he learned more than in all his years of study. He learned that wisdom isn't the accumulation of right answers, but the capacity to be present. He learned that understanding comes not from intellectual mastery, but from direct experience. One day, a new student arrived and asked Zenkai a complicated philosophical question. The student expected an elaborate answer, but Zenkai simply said, "What color is the mountain?" The new student looked confused, just as the scholar had. The scholar, who was nearby, smiled. He understood now. The master wasn't being cryptic or difficult. He was offering the most direct teaching possible. Stop trying to be right. Start being present. The answers you seek aren't in your head. They're in the direct experience of reality, which is always here, always available, like a mountain that needs no explanation for its being. Years later, when the former scholar had become a teacher himself, students would sometimes ask him complicated questions, showing off their learning, and he would remember Zenkai's method. Sometimes he would answer their question directly, but sometimes he would give them what appeared to be a wrong answer, an irrelevant response, something that would frustrate their expectation of being confirmed in their rightness. Being right is a prison, he would tell them when they complained. When you're sure you're right, you stop looking, stop questioning, stop being open to reality as it actually is. Sometimes the best teaching is the one that makes you wrong, that strips away your certainty, that leaves you not knowing. In that not knowing, real understanding becomes possible. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, you might notice all the ways you're trying to be right. Right about how you should relax. Right about how sleep should come. Right about what this experience should be like. What if you let go of being right? What if you allowed yourself to not know, to be uncertain, to be present to whatever this moment actually is, rather than what you think it should be? The mountain doesn't try to be the right kind of mountain. It is just a mountain, completely, without self-consciousness or doubt. You don't need to be the right kind of person or rest the right way. You can just be completely, presently, without the burden of rightness. Let your certainty go. Let your need to understand go. Let yourself be wrong, confused, not knowing. And in that openness, rest comes naturally, like evening light on a mountain that never asked to be any particular color. With each breath, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen, where the smallest stone may hold the greatest truth. Here starts the next story. In a bustling market town, there were 2 merchants who sold rice side by side. One was named Kenji, the other Taro. Both had successful businesses. Both were known throughout the region. but their approaches to business could not have been more different. Kenji used scales that he had carefully adjusted to weigh slightly in his favor. Not much, just enough that most customers wouldn't notice. Over the course of a year, this small deception added significantly to his profits. He told himself everyone did it, that it was just smart business, that customers expected to be cheated a little and factored it into their calculations. Taro, on the other hand, used scales that were calibrated perfectly. He would even add a bit extra to each purchase, telling customers, better to give too much than too little. His profits were smaller than Kenji's, but his conscience was clear. Kenji would mock Taro privately. "You're a fool," he would say. "You could be making so much more. The customers don't know the difference. Why cheat yourself?" "I'm not cheating myself," Taro would reply. "I'm paying myself in peace of mind. Every transaction I make, I know I've been honest. That's worth more to me than extra profit." "Peace of mind doesn't feed your family," Kenji scoffed. "Money feeds your family." For years this continued. Kenji's business appeared more successful. He had a larger house, finer clothes, and more luxuries. Taro lived modestly, comfortable, but not wealthy. To outside observers, Kenji's approach seemed vindicated. Then one day, a wealthy lord came to the market to purchase rice for his household. He was known for being meticulous and for testing merchants' honesty. He had brought his own perfectly calibrated scales. He went first to Kenji's stall and purchased a measure of rice. Then he weighed it on his own scales. The shortage was immediately apparent. "Your scales are dishonest," the lord said coldly. Kenji's face went white. "My lord, there must be some mistake." "Perhaps your scales are inaccurate." "My scales are tested regularly by the Imperial Standards Office," the lord replied. "Yours are deliberately fraudulent. Not only will I not purchase from you, but I will ensure that everyone in my household and in my social circle knows of your dishonesty." The lord then went to Taro's stall and made the same purchase. When he weighed it on his own scales, he found that Taro had actually given more than the agreed upon amount. "Your scales are generous," the lord said with approval. "I prefer to err on the side of giving too much," Taro replied simply. "Then you have earned my business and my recommendation," the lord said. "From now on, all the rice for my household will be purchased from you, and I will tell others of your integrity." Within weeks, Taro's business had doubled, then tripled. The lord's recommendation brought customers from the wealthiest families in the region. Meanwhile, Kenji's business collapsed. Once word spread about his dishonest scales, even his regular customers stopped coming. His reputation destroyed, he eventually had to close his stall. Years later, Kenji came to Taro, humbled and seeking work. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I thought honesty was expensive, but dishonesty cost me everything." Taro hired him, but on one condition, that Kenji help maintain the scales, calibrating them regularly to ensure perfect accuracy. "You need to rebuild your relationship with honesty," Taro said. "Start here, with these scales. Every time you calibrate them, remember that integrity isn't about what others can see. It's about what you know about yourself." As Kenji worked with the honest scales day after day, something shifted in him. He had spent so many years cheating in small ways that he had forgotten what it felt like to be completely honest. The dishonesty had eaten at him in ways he hadn't even recognized, creating a constant low-level anxiety about being discovered, a subtle shame he carried everywhere. Now, working with honest scales, treating every customer fairly, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Simple peace. No anxiety about being caught. No shame about his methods. No exhausting mental calculations about how much he could get away with. One day, a customer accidentally gave him too much money. The old Kenji would have pocketed it without comment. But now, without even thinking, he called the customer back and returned the extra coins. "You've changed," Taro observed, watching this exchange. "I'm remembering who I was before I started cheating," Kenji replied. "I forgot that honesty feels good, that it's actually easier than dishonesty because you don't have to remember your lies or worry about being discovered. I thought I was taking a shortcut to success, but I was actually taking a shortcut to misery." He looked at the scales, perfectly balanced. "These scales are the most honest thing in this market. They don't calculate or scheme or try to get away with anything. They just measure truly. I spent years being more clever than these scales and less wise." Taro nodded. The scales teach a simple lesson. Integrity is its own reward. Not because good things always happen to honest people, but because living with integrity creates internal peace that no amount of profit gained through dishonesty can match. You sleep better. You walk lighter. You meet people's eyes without flinching. These things have value that can't be measured in coins. A young merchant who was just starting came to Taro for advice. "Everyone says I should adjust my scales just a little, that it's how business is done. But it feels wrong. What should I do?" Taro had Kenji answer. "I spent 20 years cheating," Kenji said, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to restore the character I damaged in myself. The extra profit wasn't worth it, not even close. Your scales are a mirror of your character. Keep them honest, and you keep yourself honest. Cheat them, and you cheat yourself in ways that matter far more than money." The young merchant looked at Kenji with curiosity. "But didn't you make more money by cheating?" "For a while," Kenji admitted. "But I lost it all when my dishonesty was discovered. More importantly, I lost something that took much longer to rebuild. My ability to respect myself. Every time I looked in a mirror, I saw a cheat. Every time I counted my profits, I knew they were partly stolen. Every interaction with customers involved acting, pretending, and hiding what I really was. It was exhausting and corrosive." He gestured to the perfectly balanced scales. "These scales are at peace. They have nothing to hide, nothing to defend, nothing to remember or cover up. They just are what they are. That's what integrity gives you. The peace of being what you are without pretense or deception. It's the most valuable thing I've learned, and I learned it the hard way." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own scales. Where in your life are you adjusting the balance, even slightly in your own favor? Where are you being less than completely honest, with others or with yourself? These small dishonesties might seem insignificant, but they accumulate. They create a background noise of anxiety and shame that you carry everywhere. What would it feel like to calibrate your scales perfectly? To be completely honest, even when no one is watching, even when you could get away with a small deception. Not because of fear of being caught, but because integrity itself is the reward. Because living with honest scales creates an internal peace that no amount of clever advantage taking can provide. Rest tonight in honesty. Let go of all the small ways you've been adjusting the scales. Let go of the exhausting mental work of maintaining deceptions. Be like the perfectly balanced scale, true, honest, at peace with what you are. The reward isn't somewhere in the future. The reward is the immediate relief of no longer having to hide, to calculate, to worry about being discovered. Honest scales don't lie awake at night. Neither do honest hearts. In a village where bread was the staple food, there lived a baker named Tomoe, who had learned the craft from her mother and grandmother. She took great pride in her work, waking before dawn each day to prepare dough, tend the oven, and produce loaves that the village depended on. Tomoe had baked thousands of loaves over the years, and she rarely made mistakes anymore. Her hands knew the feel of properly kneaded dough. Her eyes could judge oven temperature by the color of the fire. Her timing was precise. Day after day, she produced bread that was consistently good, reliable, exactly what people expected. But one morning, something went wrong. A neighbor had stopped by to talk just as Tomoe was loading loaves into the oven. Distracted by the conversation, she forgot about the bread. By the time she remembered, smoke was pouring from the oven. She pulled out loaf after loaf of burnt bread, each one blackened and ruined. Tomoe was devastated. In 15 years of baking, she had never destroyed an entire day's batch. The waste of ingredients troubled her. The loss of income for the day worried her, but most of all, her pride was wounded. She had been perfect for so long, and now she had failed in the most basic way. She sat among the burnt loaves, feeling terrible. Her young apprentice, a girl named Kiku, came in and saw the disaster. "What happened?" Kiku asked. "I forgot," Tomoe said miserably. "I was distracted and I forgot. After 15 years of baking, I made a beginner's mistake." Kiku picked up one of the burnt loaves, examining it. "So this is what happens when bread stays in the oven too long." "Yes, it's completely ruined, worthless." But Kiku was looking at him with fascination. She had been apprenticing for 6 months and had never seen burnt bread before. Tomoe was so skilled that mistakes never happened in her presence. "How much too long was it in there?" Kiku asked. Tomoe thought. "Perhaps 10 minutes passed when I should have removed it." And what if it had been 5 minutes too long instead of 10? Tomoe considered this. She had actually never experimented with deliberately over-baking bread, so she wasn't certain. "I suppose it would be burnt, but less severely. Could it still be eaten if it were only 5 minutes over?" "Perhaps if you cut away the worst parts." Kiku set down the burnt loaf and picked up another. "And this one is burnt differently than that one. Why?" Tomoe looked more carefully at the loaves she had been too upset to really examine. Kiku was right. They had been in different parts of the oven, so they had burnt in different ways. Some were charred uniformly. Others were only burnt on one side. Some had burnt crusts but soft interiors. Each loaf told a story about where it had been in the oven and how fire had affected it. "I've been baking for 6 months, Kiku said, "and I've only learned how to do things right. I've never learned what happens when things go wrong, but you just learned more in one mistake than I've learned in weeks of getting it right." Tomo looked at her young apprentice with new appreciation. The girl had wisdom beyond her years. "You're right," Tomo said slowly. "I've been so focused on perfection that I've stopped learning. Every loaf I bake comes out the same. I'm not growing or discovering anything new. I'm just repeating what I already know how to do." She stood up and examined the burnt loaves more systematically. "This one," she said, pointing, "was at the back of the oven where it's hottest. It burnt fastest. These along the side got less direct heat. They took longer to burn. And this one right in front, it actually caught fire briefly before I pulled it out." Kiku watched her teacher transform from defeated to curious, from ashamed to engaged. "You know what?" Tomo said. "I'm going to deliberately burn some bread. Different amounts, different positions in the oven, different types of dough. I'm going to learn what I don't know because I've been too careful to ever make these mistakes." Over the following weeks, Tomo conducted experiments that would have horrified her former perfectionist self. She deliberately overbaked loaves to see what happened. She underbaked some. She tried different temperatures, different positions in the oven, different lengths of time. She made every mistake she could think of, carefully observing the results. What she learned transformed her baking. She discovered that what she had called perfect was actually just one point on a spectrum of possibilities. She found that slightly underbaked bread had a chewier texture that some people preferred. She learned that bread with a darker crust had a richer flavor. She discovered techniques she never would have tried if she hadn't been forced out of her perfect routine by that first mistake. Her bread became more varied, more interesting, more responsive to what different customers wanted. People who had been eating her consistently good bread for years suddenly found themselves excited by it again. "What changed?" they would ask. "Your bread seems different lately." Tomo would smile and say, "I finally made a mistake. And that mistake taught me more than years of getting it right." One day, a traveling baker who was considered a master of the craft stopped at Tomo's shop. He tasted her bread and was impressed. "You understand bread deeply," he said. "How did you learn so much?" "I burnt a whole day's batch," Tomo replied. "And instead of just feeling bad about it, I decided to learn from it. That mistake opened doors I didn't even know existed." The master baker nodded knowingly. The problem with being good at something is that you stop making mistakes. And when you stop making mistakes, you stop learning. You just keep repeating what you already know. It's the mistakes, if you pay attention to them, that show you what you don't yet understand. He looked around at her thriving shop. People think mastery means never making mistakes, but real mastery comes from making mistakes consciously, learning from them, and letting them teach you what success never can. Years later, when Kiku had become a skilled baker herself and taken over Tomo's shop, she would tell new apprentices about the day of the burnt bread. "My teacher was perfect for 15 years, she would say, and in those 15 years, her skill barely grew. But one mistake, one moment of failure, opened up years of new learning. Don't fear mistakes. Pay attention to them. They're often more valuable teachers than success." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own burnt bread, the mistakes you've made, the failures you've experienced, the times things went wrong. Are you still punishing yourself for these mistakes? Still seeing them only as evidence of inadequacy? What if those mistakes were actually your best teachers? What if failure, when you pay attention to it, reveals possibilities that success keeps hidden? What if the things you did wrong showed you more than all the things you did right? You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to get everything right. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is make a mistake, pay attention to what happens, and let it teach you what you couldn't learn any other way. Rest now in acceptance of your imperfect humanity. Your mistakes are not failures. They're experiments. They're lessons. They're the burnt bread that teaches you something new about the oven of your own life. Let them nourish your wisdom instead of poisoning your peace. The path of Zen unfolds like morning mist, soft and patient. In this next tale, we are invited to see, beyond appearance, into essence. Listen carefully to the next story. In a mountain village, there lived a child named Hoshi, whose name meant star. He was a curious boy, always asking questions, always trying to understand how things worked. His parents admired his inquisitive mind and encouraged his questions. One clear night, Hoshi lay on his back looking at the sky full of stars. They were so numerous, so bright in the mountain air, so beautiful. As he looked, a question formed in his mind. How many stars are there? He decided to count them. He began with the stars directly overhead, assigning each one a number. 1, 2, 3, 4. By the time he reached 30, he had already lost track of which ones he had counted and which he hadn't. He tried to organize them into groups, into patterns, but the more he tried to count, the less he could simply see them. His grandfather came out and found Hoshi staring at the sky with an intense, frustrated expression. "What are you doing, little star?" his grandfather asked, using the family nickname. "I'm trying to count the stars," Hoshi replied, not taking his eyes from the sky. "But they keep moving. Or maybe my eyes are moving. I can't keep track. How can I count them if they won't stay still?" His grandfather sat down beside him. "Why are you counting them?" "Because I want to know how many there are." "And if you knew how many there were, what would change?" Hoshi thought about this. "I would know. I would understand." "Would you?" His grandfather laid back on the grass beside him. "Tell me, before you started counting, when you were just looking at the stars, what did you feel?" Hoshi remembered. "I felt wonder. They were so beautiful. I felt small, but also somehow connected to them, like they were very far away, but also touching me with their light." "And now, while you're counting?" "Now I feel frustrated, confused. I keep losing count. The beauty is still there, but I'm not seeing it anymore. I'm just seeing numbers." His grandfather was quiet for a while, letting Hoshi sit with his own observation. Finally, he said, "Not everything is meant to be counted, measured, or understood. Some things are meant to be experienced. The stars don't care how many of them there are. They just shine. And you can either spend your time trying to number them, or you can receive their light." "But don't you want to know?" Hoshi asked. "Don't you want to understand?" "I know the stars are beautiful," his grandfather replied. "I know they've been shining since before humans existed and will shine after we're gone. I know that their light traveled vast distances to reach my eyes. I know that looking at them makes something in my chest feel open and quiet. Those are the things worth knowing. How many there are? That's a question that turns the sky into a math problem. Hoshi stopped counting and just looked. His grandfather was right. The moment he stopped trying to number the stars, he could see them again. Really see them. The way they shimmered, the way some were bright and others faint. The way they formed patterns that his ancestors had named. The way they made the night less dark. Everything you count or measure, his grandfather continued, you transform from an experience into data. Data is useful for some things, but it can never capture what it feels like to lie on your back and watch stars shine. It can never measure wonder. It can never quantify the feeling in your chest when beauty takes your breath away. A shooting star streaked across the sky. Hoshi gasped with delight, and his grandfather smiled. If you had been counting at that moment, his grandfather said, you might have missed it. You would have been too busy tracking which number you were on, making sure you didn't count the same star twice. You would have been in your head instead of being present to this moment. As Hoshi grew older, he remembered that night often. He noticed how his urge to quantify and measure things sometimes pulled him out of direct experience. When he ate something delicious, his mind would immediately start comparing it to other meals, rating it, analyzing its components. When he saw a beautiful sunset, he would try to describe it, to capture it in words, losing the direct experience in the attempt to translate it. He learned to notice this pattern and sometimes choose differently. Sometimes he would let experiences be experiences without trying to understand them, explain them, measure them, or capture them. He would just receive them directly, the way he had learned to receive starlight. Years later, Hoshi became a teacher. Students would come to him with questions about meditation, about enlightenment, about the nature of reality, and often he would take them outside at night and tell them to look at the stars. How many are there? He would ask. The students would start trying to count, and he would let them struggle for a while. Eventually, they would give up, frustrated. I can't count them, they would say. There are too many. They keep shifting. I lose track. So stop counting, Hoshi would reply. Just look. Experience the stars without trying to understand them intellectually. Let them be what they are without needing to measure them, categorize them, or explain them. He would let them lie there in silence, just experiencing the night sky. And usually something would shift. The students who had arrived full of questions, full of the need to understand and explain and intellectually grasp everything, would find themselves simply present, simply aware, simply experiencing without the mediating layer of thought. Some of your questions are like counting stars, Hoshi would tell them. They turn experience into problems to solve. They transform presence into analysis. Your mind asks these questions to feel like it's doing something useful. But often what's most useful is to stop asking and just be present to what is. But how do we know if we're making progress? Students would ask. How do we measure our growth? Hoshi would smile. You're counting stars again. Progress in meditation isn't something you measure, it's something you experience. You know you're growing not because you can quantify it, but because you notice you're suffering less, responding to life more skillfully, feeling more at peace. These are experiences, not numbers. Tonight, As you prepare for rest, notice if your mind is counting stars. Is it trying to measure your relaxation? Track your progress towards sleep. Analyze whether you're doing this correctly. Is it turning the simple experience of resting into a problem to solve or a performance to evaluate? What if you stopped counting? What if you let this moment be an experience instead of a measurement? What if you received rest the way you receive starlight, directly, without trying to quantify it, or understand it, or capture it? Some things are meant to be lived, not analyzed. Some moments are meant to be experienced, not examined. Tonight is one of those moments. Let yourself be like the child who stopped counting and simply gazed at the stars, receiving their light without needing to know how many there were. That's enough. You're enough. This moment is enough. No counting necessary. In the hush of understanding, Zen offers us another glimpse of what it means to recognize worth not by weight or shine, but by presence. Here starts the next story, in a mountain village where mist clung to the slopes like silk. There lived a tea master named Sozan, who had perfected his craft over 40 years. His reputation had spread across 3 provinces. People said that to drink tea prepared by Sozan was to taste enlightenment itself. One autumn morning, a young merchant named Kenji arrived at Sozan's simple tea house. Kenji wore expensive robes and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had succeeded early in life. He had read 7 books about the tea ceremony. He had attended demonstrations by famous masters in the capital. He had purchased the finest tea utensils money could buy. "Master Sozan," Kenji announced as he entered, not waiting to be invited in. "I have come to learn the secrets of tea ceremony. I've studied extensively, you see. I understand the basic principles, of course. What I need from you are the advanced techniques, the hidden knowledge that books don't contain." Sozan, who had been sitting quietly by the window watching leaves drift past, turned slowly and smiled. His face was deeply lined, kind, patient as stone. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the mat across from him. Kenji sat, but even in sitting, he radiated impatience. His eyes moved around the room, cataloguing, comparing, judging. The tea house was simpler than he had expected. Bare walls, plain cushions, nothing impressive at all. Sozan began to prepare tea with movements so natural they seemed like breathing. Each gesture flowed into the next without hesitation or thought. But before he could explain anything, Kenji interrupted. "Yes, I know about cleansing the implements. I've read about that. What I really want to understand is the spiritual dimension. The books mention it, but they are quite vague." Sozan nodded quietly and continued his preparation. He heated water. He measured tea. His hands moved with a grace that 40 years of daily practice had made effortless. Again, Kenji interrupted. "I've been told there are different schools of thought about whisking technique. Which do you follow? I have my own theories about which is most authentic." The old master said nothing. He simply continued, reaching for a simple clay cup, placing it before his guest. Then he lifted the kettle and began to pour. The tea flowed into the cup, dark and fragrant. Steam rose. The cup filled to the brim. But Sozan didn't stop pouring. Tea spilled over the edges, pooling on the wooden tray. Still, Sozan poured. The pool spread wider, reaching the edge of the table. Tea began to drip onto the mat below. It soaked into Kenji's expensive robes. "Stop!" Kenji shouted, jumping back. "Can't you see the cup is full?" "No more will go in." Sozin set down the kettle carefully. He looked at Kenji with the same gentle expression he'd worn since the beginning. In his eyes was something that wasn't quite amusement, but wasn't quite sadness either. Just a deep, patient knowing. "Like this cup," he said softly. "You are full of your own opinions, your own ideas, your own certainty about what you already know. How can I show you anything new when there is no space inside you to receive it?" Kenji opened his mouth to argue, to explain that he wasn't full, that he was here to learn after all. But the words stopped in his throat. He looked down at his tea-soaked robes. He thought about how he had entered this room, already knowing what he would find, what he would learn, what the master would say. Had he come here to learn? Or had he come here to confirm what he already believed? "Every person who came to me this week," Sozin continued, his voice still soft, still kind, had an empty cup. They knew they didn't know. You are the first to arrive with a cup already full. Kenji sat back down slowly. The tea was still dripping from the table. The sound was like a small clock, marking moments. "Master," he said, and his voice was different now. Smaller, younger. "I don't know anything about tea at all, do I?" "You know many facts about tea," Sozin replied. "You have gathered information like autumn leaves in a basket. But knowing about tea is not the same as knowing tea. Understanding tea ceremony from books is like understanding the ocean from a map. The map has truth in it, yes, but it is not wet. It has no salt. It cannot carry you anywhere." He poured a fresh cup, this time stopping when the cup was full. "The tea ceremony is not about secrets or advanced techniques," Sozin explained. "It is about presence. Attention, respect, humility. These are not complicated. A child can understand them. But they are difficult because they require us to empty ourselves first." Kenji looked at the fresh cup of tea before him. Steam rose from it in delicate spirals. He realized he had never actually paid attention to tea before. He had drunk it hundreds of times while thinking about business, reading scrolls, planning his next acquisition. He had attended tea ceremonies where he spent the entire time comparing the master's technique to what he'd read in books. But right now, in this moment, he was seeing tea for the first time. He lifted the cup with both hands, the way Sozin had shown him. He brought it to his lips slowly. He tasted it, really tasted it. The bitterness, the subtle sweetness beneath, the warmth spreading through his chest. "This is the first cup of tea I have ever drunk," he said quietly. Sozin smiled. "Yes, this is humility, not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. When you empty yourself of certainty, everything becomes new. Every cup of tea is the first cup. Every breath is the first breath." Kenji stayed with Sozin for 3 months. Each day he practiced emptying his cup. It was harder than he expected. His mind kept filling itself with opinions, judgments, comparisons. But slowly he learned. Not new techniques, but a new way of being present. Years later, when Kenji had his own students, they would notice something unusual about how he taught. He never claimed to have all the answers. He never said, "This is the only way." Instead, he would ask questions. He would create space for his students to discover on their own. When asked about his approach, He would smile and tell the story of a cup that overflowed. "My master taught me that learning begins with emptiness," he would say. "The moment we think we know everything is the moment we stop growing. So I try to keep my cup empty, always ready to be filled again." This teaching about emptiness, about humility, is one that serves us even now, even here, as we prepare for rest. How often do we approach each day, each moment, each person, already full of what we think we know? How often do we miss what's actually present because we're too busy confirming our expectations? Tonight, as you settle into rest, you might practice this same emptiness. Let go of what you think you know about sleep, about relaxation, about how this should feel. Empty your cup completely. And in that emptiness, something new can pour in. Something fresh, something true. As the lantern of awareness glows a little brighter, we come to a tale about seeing with more than the eyes. Let the stillness guide you now, and listen carefully to the next story.